That's what happened, Winter said to the 5 people in front of him. Nick, Jenny, Trevor, Jonathan, and Kiara stood before Winter, who had just told them what the guards had found in Cycle. He really freed all the Specters without telling anyone? Kiara asked in shock. Winter nodded. Artem is an egomaniac. He doesn't care about anyone else when something is even mildly bothering him. He is the most important thing, and if he stubs his toe, he wouldn't care if he had to kill 1,000 people to make the pain go away. He chuckled. And with what Nick told me Artem went through, I doubt he had anything but rage and hatred in his mind. Trevor and Jenny chuckled too. Nick had already told them how he'd thrown Artem into the sewers. Did anyone survive? Jonathan asked with worry. He had worked with the people in Cycle for a long while, and he didn't want to see any of them die. Except for Artem, maybe. 2 of the guards and 1 of the clerks managed to flee, Winter said. The others were killed by the Specters. Kiara sighed. Why did this have to happen? When you know the city is about to repossess your company, the only thing you can do is make it as difficult as possible for them to get your stuff, Winter explained. He can't destroy the building since it's leased in his name and he doesn't own it. He can't just kill his people, since that would be considered sabotage. The only thing he can do is let out all the Specters and act like it was an accident. Nick furrowed his brows. Is there no way to fool the city? Artem is also a Melfian, right? Shouldn't there be some way to deal with the inspection? He already did everything he could, Winter said. While the building is leased in his name, Cycle doesn't officially belong to him. It doesn't? Nick asked in surprise. No, Winter answered, shaking his head. Officially, his chief Zephyx Extractor owns 51% of Cycle. Unofficially, he owned all of it, but only the official accounts matter. He can claim he raised the issues about personnel and the Specters potentially breaking out with the chief Zephyx Extractor, who ignored them. And since the chief Zephyx Extractor officially owns the majority, he couldn't do anything without that permission. Under normal circumstances, when your business is judged unfit to hold Specters, you also receive a hefty fine and a long mandatory work sentence for endangering the city. Yet since Artem didn't officially own most of his business, he can't be held accountable, which means he won't lose any of his personal wealth. The 5 Extractors were not happy when they heard that. Artem would get away scot-free. That was so unfair. Will Artem take his revenge? Jonathan asked. That won't be easy, Winter answered. Since he officially failed to earn his inheritance, he has to access the family fortune via the traditional route, becoming strong enough to control a major part of the Melfian family. He'll need to become an expert at the very least, and if he wants to control a substantial amount of the family's power, he'll need to become a specialist, a level 5 extractor. Blitz will hire Artem as a level 2 extractor, and he'll have to work his way up the ladder. Due to our family name, he'll get the job, but once he's officially part of Blitz, he has to work just as hard as anyone else. And Blitz is very strict with how their employees conduct themselves. Blitz represents Crimson Fungus City, and if one of their employees is found using their position to suppress people outside Blitz, they will terminate that employee and make sure they don't find a job anywhere else. If you want to make it in Blitz, your conduct has to be exemplary. While Artem hates us, and Nick specifically, he won't sacrifice his life and future for revenge, Winter explained. Artem might be an impulsive idiot, but that's by my standards, not general ones. He isn't dumb enough to throw his life away for something like that. The Extractors had mixed feelings. On the one hand, they were glad Artem most likely wouldn't cause them problems in the future. On the other, all of this felt so unjust. Even though Artem had done all these horrible things, he'd still get an amazing job in Blitz. Artem's fate after messing up everything was one nearly everyone in the city wished for. It was so unfair. Everyone was silent for several seconds. On a positive note, Winter continued, the guards captured all 3 Specters and put them back into their containment units. Dark Dream has also received ownership of all of them. A collective sigh of relief was released. They had still been nervous about whether they'd get the Specters. And not only that, Winter said. The others looked at him with raised eyebrows. I also got in contact with the owner of the building, and I acquired the lease. The Zephyx Extractor's eyes widened. The building is far better than the warehouse we're in right now. It has space for up to 20 containment units of regular size and plenty of rooms for all kinds of things. While the lease is expensive, it's not an issue. After all, we now officially own 5 Specters. Winter smiled brightly. After a moment, Nick smiled too. Dark Dream was about to undergo another evolution. Chapter 171, New Home. A group of around 20 people stood in front of the tall building that had once belonged to Cycle. Almost all of Dark Dream's employees had gathered here. Nick and Winter were at the front, with the 4 Zephyx Extractors, Jenny, Jonathan, Kiara, and Trevor, behind them. Behind the Extractors were 6 guards, 3 who had worked for Dark Dream before and 3 new hires. Since their new building was no longer as open as the warehouse, they needed more guards to patrol the corridors. Behind the guards were 6 clerks and assistants whose job was to receive guests and handle day-to-day matters like cleaning and sending messages. Right now, all of them looked at the tall building with wonder and excitement. This was where they were going to work from now on. Finally, they could get out of that shitty old warehouse. Now they felt like they were working for an actual Zephyx manufacturer. "Let's go inside," Winter said, gesturing for everyone to follow. Nick nodded and looked behind him with a threatening expression. At the Dreamer. Naturally, the Specters had to move into the new building as well. Luckily, since Dark Dream only had 2, they didn't need to put much effort into moving. The screaming coffin was carried by Jonathan and Trevor, and the Dreamer stood in the middle of all the Extractors. The coffin didn't care about anything and was simply lazing around, still digesting the fat man's corpse, and if the Dreamer tried to escape, it would be shut down by 5 Extractors. Usually, moving Specters from one building to another was a huge undertaking, but with only 2, it wasn't a big deal. Fortunately, the people who sold the containment units also offered a moving service. They would build a containment unit identical to the old one in the new building. Then the Zephyx manufacturer would move the Specter from one unit to the other. Lastly, the old unit would be taken away by the sellers. This service cost around 10% of what the containment unit was worth. So there were already 2 fitting containment units for the screaming coffin and the Dreamer in the new building. A moment later, the group walked into the building. "Mind showing us around?" Winter asked, looking at Kiara and Jonathan. They had worked in this building just days ago. "Of course," Jonathan said with a smirk. By now, Jonathan and Kiara had warmed up to their new colleagues, and Jonathan's confident attitude had returned. "HMPH," Kiara uttered from the side. "Look at how cocky you sound. Hard to believe you nearly shat your pants when you saw Boss for the first time." Some of the people chuckled, while Jonathan went red in the face. "This is the main hall," Jonathan said, as if he hadn't just been humiliated. "There are several staircases on each side. If one collapses, we can still use the others. The building has 7 floors, and the middle 5 are for the containment units. The first floor is for entertaining guests and acts as a safe meeting place. The 7th floor was always reserved for the business end, meeting rooms, offices, and the central controls for the building. The dung heap is on the—" "That's enough. Thank you, Jonathan," Winter said, interrupting him. Jonathan realized he had nearly unveiled the identities of all the Specters in front of the normal employees, and became ashamed. Luckily, everyone already knew the dung heap, since it had been Cycle's main Specter. At his side, Kiara smirked in schadenfreude. She had never truly been a fan of Jonathan, and after he'd surrendered without putting up a fight, she liked him even less. "I'll leave you to look around the building," Winter said to the non-Extractors. "For now, only the containment units are off limits since we haven't officially moved in yet. Get familiar with your new workplace today. Starting tomorrow, you'll officially resume working." The employees nodded and thanked him. Then Winter turned to the Extractors. "Let's deal with the Specters," he said, walking toward one of the staircases on the right. The normal employees understood they weren't supposed to follow, and decided to stay in the main hall. The stairway was wide, with a big open area in the middle, designed that way so Zephyx Extractors could quickly go from one floor to another. Nick, for example, could climb onto the fortified railing and leap from the 7th floor to the 3rd through the empty space in the middle. Winter and Nick walked at the front, and Nick kept looking at the Dreamer. The Dreamer just stared forward with dead eyes. Right now, it was not restrained at all, even though Dark Dream could have done so. The point was to reward the Dreamer for being cooperative, a little show of trust, even if it wasn't really, since it couldn't escape 5 Extractors anyway. Naturally, Dark Dream didn't trust the Dreamer at all. This was just an empty gesture to keep it comfortable so it didn't try to escape. Obviously, it would try eventually, but not with desperation, as long as it was somewhat happy. The group climbed to the 5th floor and entered the main hallway again. The 5th floor looked very different from the first. One hallway ran left to right, and 3 ran front and back, 1 through the middle and 2 along the sides. This split the floor into 2 parts, each with space for 2 containment units. The employee entrances of the units were in the middle hallway, and the Specter entrances were in the side hallways. The group led the Dreamer down one of the side hallways. A moment later, one of the walls split open after a loud alarm. Without being ordered, the Dreamer walked into the containment unit. Then the unit closed. The Dreamer had moved into its new home. Chapter 172, Floors. After putting the Dreamer into its new home, the group dumped the screaming coffin into its containment unit on the 2nd floor. Wintour had also told everyone how he planned to divide the Specters. Nearly every floor would be dedicated to a different kind. The 2nd floor was for possession Specters, and it had the screaming coffin and the dung heap. The dung heap wasn't really a possession Specter, but it essentially acted like one, a physical Specter with an actual body that couldn't move very fast. Wintour kept it on the 2nd floor with the screaming coffin for that reason. Possession Specters rarely escaped, and the 2nd floor was closest to the exit. The 3rd and 4th floors were for general physical Specters, the most numerous kind. Well, Wintour actually dedicated 3 floors to them, but that would be explained later. Right now they only had one normal physical Specter, the Bleeding Lady, residing on the 3rd floor. The 5th floor was for Specters that fed on mentality. Wintour wanted to keep these separate from all the others because of the normal employees. Accidents always happen, and some Specters might gain the ability to influence people beyond their containment unit. Zephyx Extractors had great resistance to such things, but normal people didn't. So Wintour wanted these Specters off-limits to all normal employees. Only Zephyx Extractors were allowed on the 5th floor, no clerks or guards. In fact, after today, Wintour would include himself in that list. He was a mid-newbie, but he didn't want to get into the habit of ignoring his own regulations. At some point, Dark Dream would have stronger Specters, and then his mental resistance would barely be better than a normal person's. As the CEO, it would be really bad if a Specter controlled him. Finally, the 6th floor was for 4 Specters. Dark Dream didn't have any yet. This was how all the floors were set up. Naturally, the normal employees felt nervous entering any floor with containment units, but they were especially scared of the 5th. They didn't know what kind of Specters Dark Dream owned, so they didn't know why they weren't allowed on the 5th floor. That made it extremely scary. What kind of Specter was up there that they weren't even allowed to clean the place? But that wasn't the only concerning floor. The 2nd floor was too, not for danger but for annoyance and disgust. The dung heap smell couldn't be perfectly contained, so its odor permeated the 2nd floor. The place smelled like rotten garbage all the time, and the employees hated going there. Luckily, it wasn't dangerous, just disgusting. "I'm going to set up the 7th floor," Wintour told Nick. "You should get everyone familiar with the new Specters before work tomorrow." Nick nodded. "What about the new employees?" "They'll come next week," Wintour said. "I already signed the contract with them in Ghosty's lab." Ghosty's lab had the most newbies, and surprisingly, they weren't against other manufacturers taking them. The reason was the release fee. Ghosty's lab hired more newbies than they needed, knowing other manufacturers would poach them. The release fee for a newbie was more than the newbie brought in within a year. This was essentially free money for Ghosty's lab. Since Dark Dream needed more extractors, Wintour had taken out a loan and bought 3 more. They were just early newbies, but already far better than normal people. They'd been tested by Ghosty's lab, had already worked with Specters, and had some experience. Most of all, they had the standard ability most of Ghosty's lab's extractors had. The adult Specter Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis was a floating ball of liquid metal that gained power by causing terror and fear. Extractors who worked with it got its ability, useful for almost everything, reshaping metal into weapons, tools, walls, whatever. While the base ability wasn't amazing for fighting, it could be mutated in many ways. If one of these people evolved it with the dung heap, for example, they might create a thin wave of metal with poisonous properties, essentially a wave of acid. The 3 newbies Wintour had bought all had the base ability of metamorphosis. Hearing the 3 would arrive next week, Nick nodded. "Good, I'll teach them about all the Specters when they're here." Wintour chuckled. "I would assume so, it's your job after all." Nick laughed a bit in embarrassment. "Anyway, be careful with the new Specters. I heard the Lover and the Bleeding Lady are scarier than the Dreamer," Wintour said. Kiara and Jonathan nodded in agreement. In their opinion, the Bleeding Lady was the scariest Specter, followed by the Lover. "No worries," Nick said. "I don't have any," Wintour answered, before heading into the stairway to go to the 7th floor. After Wintour left, Nick looked at his 4 employees. Kiara and Jonathan were a bit excited, while Trevor and Jenny were a bit worried. "I'd say let's get the hard part out of the way first," Nick said. "Wanna start with the bleeding lady." Chapter 173, The Bleeding Lady. The 5 people went to the 3rd floor, where only the bleeding lady was housed. Kiara led everyone to the containment unit and showed them how to operate it. The unit Artem had bought for the bleeding lady was even better than the one housing the dreamer, with a couple more functions. After that, Kiara looked at Jonathan. "You show him." Jonathan knew what she meant and nodded. "Boss, I'll bring you to the bleeding lady. She's very unstable and gets aggressive quickly, which is why Steven and Feuduma always told us to go into the containment unit with at most 2 people. Any more and she might become violent. Well, more violent than normal." Nick nodded. Then he and Jonathan went through the door. Compared to the warehouse, this building had small rooms between the hallway and the containment unit. After going through the door, Nick found himself in a small locker room with a shower. "Boss, if you don't want your uniform ruined, you have to take it off," Jonathan said, starting to undress. Nick raised an eyebrow but did as told. "Keep your underpants on, boss," Jonathan added. "The bleeding lady has a very strong reaction to male genitalia." Nick nodded without a word. "Next, we cleanse our bodies," Jonathan said, walking into the shower. A moment later, blue liquid came out of the shower head, and Jonathan left after about 10 seconds. The good thing about cleansing liquid was that it didn't stick, so they didn't get wet. Nick took a quick shower too. "I presume you're comfortable with blood, boss?" Jonathan asked. Nick just nodded. Jonathan nodded back and put his hand on the actual entrance to the containment unit. Then he sighed. "She's probably quite upset right now. Be prepared to get cut a lot." "Are the cuts dangerous?" Nick asked. "Depends," Jonathan answered. "She has 2 kinds, good ones and bad ones. The bad ones will actually kill you, but she only uses them when she feels threatened. The good ones draw blood and are very painful but close quickly. The good thing is it's very clear when she's about to actually attack. If it happens, I'll warn you. For now, please just follow my commands, boss." Nick nodded. "Sure, you know her better than me." "All right," Jonathan said with a sigh, turning to the door. "Here we go." Then he pushed it open, and the 2 of them slowly walked in. The door closed behind them, and Nick found himself in a crimson-red room. It surprised him a bit, since containment units usually didn't come in that ominous color. The unit was lit by a reflective shaft that captured sunlight from outside and brought it in. In the corner, Nick saw a person quietly sitting. By her looks, she was a young woman, probably 18 to 20 years old. She was completely naked, with numerous healing cuts all over her body. Long black hair fell from her head and almost encompassed her. "She's the reason for the red color," Jonathan whispered. "She gets agitated when she's somewhere that isn't red. She painted the room with her own blood." Nick felt his heart rate increase, but he still had control over himself. His body was ready to jump into a fight at any moment. The bleeding lady must have already noticed the 2 new people in her containment unit, but she gave no sign of doing anything. She just looked at the ground, her face hidden behind her hair. Jonathan gestured for Nick to follow slowly and walked forward. "Hello, long time no see," Jonathan said in a quiet, calming voice. The bleeding lady showed no reaction. "Do you want a bit of blood?" Jonathan asked carefully. She said nothing. "You can have a bit of blood, but only if you want," Jonathan said, bending down to her eye level. Then he stopped advancing. There was still about a meter between them. After some seconds, she lifted her head. Nick felt a cold shiver run down his back, and he saw the bleeding holes where her eyes should be. For a bit, she just looked at Jonathan. Then she slowly turned to Nick, who stood a meter behind him. "Hello, I'm Nick," he said in a calming voice, looking deeply into the bleeding lady's eyes. "He's my new boss," Jonathan said. "He's just here to meet you." After about 5 seconds of silence, the bleeding lady slowly lifted one of her fingers, her long nails extending upward. "I will kill you," she said quietly in a cute voice. Nick did nothing and just watched. "Yes, you will kill me," Jonathan said with a nervous smile, extending his right arm. Her long fingernail went to his wrist and moved upward. A deep cut appeared, and he began to bleed heavily. Nick watched with worry. Surprisingly, not even 10 seconds later the blood stopped, leaving a deep red crevice in Jonathan's wrist. He did his best to seem calm, but Nick could tell he was in severe pain. "I will kill you," she said again, moving her long nail over Jonathan's chest. A huge cut went across his torso, but like the last one, it quickly stopped bleeding. "I will kill you." Another cut across his arm. "I will kill you." A huge one on his leg. About 2 minutes later, the bleeding lady stopped. There were over 10 cuts across Jonathan's body, yet the first ones were already vanishing, and he didn't seem weakened by the blood loss at all. A moment later, she turned to Nick and extended one of her nails. "I will kill you." Chapter 174, Blood. Nick looked at the bleeding lady. "Come closer," Jonathan said from the side. Nick took a couple of steps forward and went to his knees, just like Jonathan. Then he extended his left arm. The bleeding lady slowly moved her nail across Nick's wrist. Scratch. Yet it didn't bleed. There was a cut, but it drew no blood. Jonathan started to sweat profusely. It's okay," he said quickly in a calming tone. "My boss is a bit stronger than me. You can play a bit rougher with him. Come, try again." Nick noticed the bleeding lady's body was shaking with intensity. "Move back," Jonathan whispered, his voice veiled and urgent. Nick stood and took 3 steps back. Jonathan moved his hand behind his back and gestured for Nick to ready his weapon. Nick understood but didn't move. He didn't want to look suspicious, but inside he was ready for a fight. "You can try again," Jonathan said in a calming voice. "If you use more power, he can bleed too. If you want, we can try again." The bleeding lady's nail kept shaking. Some seconds passed. Eventually, her nail lowered to the ground, and Jonathan took a deep breath. A nail from her other hand rose, and she pointed at Nick. "I will kill you," she said. Jonathan gestured for Nick to come closer again. Nick did, arriving beside him and held his arm out. The bleeding lady pointed her nail at it. Nick felt power gathering on the nail, but he didn't move. Shing! A deep cut appeared on his wrist. Nick took a deep breath. That hurt like hell. He had come into contact with the nightmare many times and endured worse pain, but this cut was far more painful than a normal one. It was almost like his nerves were screaming at him with far more intensity than usual. The next moment, the bleeding lady's nail moved away, and she slowly brought her flat hand to Nick's bleeding arm. Jonathan put his arm on Nick's shoulders, signaling there was nothing to worry about. The bleeding lady touched the blood coming from Nick's arm, and it magically gathered in her hand, forming a ball. After 10 seconds, Nick stopped bleeding, and she held a big ball of blood. Surprisingly, Nick felt no pain or weakness. It was almost like he hadn't been cut at all. The next moment, the bleeding lady moved the ball onto one of her own cuts. Nick's blood clung to them, making them seem to bleed again. She did that with every cut across her body, using up the ball. Then she wrapped her hands around her legs and stopped moving. "All right, it was fun. See you soon," Jonathan said carefully, standing up. "It was fun," Nick said, standing as well. The two of them slowly walked to the exit and left. Jonathan carefully closed the door behind them. And then he collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. Nick looked at him in surprise. "What's going on?" Jonathan looked like he'd been scared for his life, staring forward in shock. "I've never seen her this mad before," he shouted. "She was mad?" Nick asked. Jonathan nodded rapidly. "When I saw her after going in, I would have run out immediately if you weren't with me. I'm just a mid-newbie, for fuck's sake. I can't fight her." Nick blinked a couple of times. "She seemed pretty calm to me." "Are you kidding?" Jonathan shouted. "She was absolutely furious when we showed up. I thought she was about to jump us any second. And did you see how many cuts she made? It took that many to calm her down. I've never been cut this much." Nick raised an eyebrow. "What's the normal number of cuts?" "Like one across the wrist, as if you tried to kill yourself, and maybe one more somewhere. After that she's content," Jonathan said. "That bitch cut up almost my entire fucking torso. Do you have any idea how hard it was not to cry out?" "What if you cry out in pain?" Nick asked. "Never do that," Jonathan shouted urgently. "That only entices her to continue. Her cutting you is like an addiction. She has to do it from time to time or she won't calm down. But if you scream, it's like her drug of choice suddenly getting far stronger and she needs more. Stay calm and quiet and she'll stop quickly. Get loud and she'll keep going until you stop crying. One way or another," he added, looking away. Nick looked at him. "You know, you actually did exemplary work just now." Jonathan looked at Nick. "I can see how terrified you are," Nick said. "But in there you acted calmly and rationally. In front of a Specter more powerful than you stayed focused and even calmed her down. You did very well." He smiled. Jonathan stared forward for a moment, then smiled. Then he smirked arrogantly. "Of course, that's to be expected." Nick just nodded, smiling. "Anyway," Jonathan said, standing up, That's one session of work. She gets one a day, and based on how much blood she drew, a certain amount of Zephyx is produced. Usually she makes about 15 grams a day, but today we might have made 50. Don't expect it to continue, though. It'll most likely be back to 15 starting tomorrow. You go in, talk to her, slowly approach, let her cut you a bit and leave. It takes less than 10 minutes a day and nets around 15 grams of Zephyx. Painful and scary, but quick and productive. That's about everything you need to know about her. Nick nodded. Thanks, you were a great help. Chapter 175, The Lover. Nick and Jonathan cleaned themselves and put their uniforms back on before coming out. The others were already waiting. How bad was it? Kiara asked. Bad, Jonathan said. She was really cranky, but she's calmed down now. What's the bleeding lady like? Jenny asked, looking at Nick. There are a lot of things you have to look out for, Nick said. Working with her is more dangerous and complicated than working with the dreamer. She also seems much more unstable, which makes it hard to guarantee our safety. I want you and Trevor to get familiar with her over the next 2 days. Every extractor should know how to work with every Specter in case someone can't come to work. But most likely, due to the danger, I'll be working with her regularly. The others were a bit surprised. Nick was going to take care of the bleeding lady. He needed to work with at least one Specter so his level could increase, but they'd assumed he'd take some other one. Still, it made sense. The bleeding lady was a physical Specter with a battle-capable ability, making her very dangerous. Even more, she was already a late hatchling. If she decided to attack an extractor, they might die. Nick had the greatest chance of survival, since they'd be fighting in a small room, and he was extremely dangerous in close proximity. He didn't say it, but Nick had another reason: time. The bleeding lady gave about as much Zephyx as the dreamer, and when she advanced a level, she'd give even more. As the chief Zephyx Extractor, Nick had many things to do, and the less time he spent working with Specters, the better. When Jonathan and Kiara heard Nick would take care of the bleeding lady, they sighed in relief. They really didn't want to work with her. First, she was insanely dangerous. Second, it was painful. Let's check up on the lover next. Kiara and Jonathan didn't seem comfortable at that. Nick noticed and raised an eyebrow. I guess it's not a lot of fun to work with. Jonathan and Kiara looked at each other. I'll tell you when we're there, Kiara said, walking to the staircase. Nick, Jenny, and Trevor felt intrigued and followed. When everyone reached the 5th floor, they stopped in front of a door. Kiara took a deep breath and readied herself to explain the lover, yet she only went red in the face. You do it, she ordered Jonathan. Me again? Jonathan asked with annoyance. Kiara just glared at him. In the end, Jonathan could only sigh. The lover is a worm with tentacles, about as big as a chicken, he said. Nick, Trevor, and Jenny were a bit surprised. They'd expected something called the lover to have a more human appearance. The lover gains power by perverting and changing someone's sexual desires, Jonathan said awkwardly. The 3 extractors, who didn't know the lover, started to feel uncomfortable. To work with it, you need to allow it to, well, you know, Jonathan said, moving his hands around. Please explain, Nick said. I want you to be clear. Jonathan scratched the back of his head in discomfort. You kinda have to let it have its way with you, if you know what I mean. Jenny was immediately disgusted. Trevor looked uncomfortable. Nick furrowed his brows. Please be more specific, Nick said. Jonathan really seemed uncomfortable. Well, first you take your pants off, he explained slowly. Then you sit down. It slowly comes closer and goes for your thing and also your butthole. The 3 grew more disgusted by the minute. It starts to do its thing, and while it's happening, you'll feel surprisingly good. While that's happening, it releases a lot of gas that makes you hallucinate. The hallucinations are of uncomfortable things: corpses, blood, feces, urine, violence, tragedy, all sorts. Yet even though you really don't like these things, the lover somehow makes you feel really, really good. Stephen and Artem talked with several doctors about this, and while it hasn't happened yet, they said repeated exposure can make your mind associate these things with pleasure. So in the long run, your preferences might change into something completely different. Jonathan scratched the back of his head. And after you finish, it leaves you alone and you can go. Silence. Nick, Jenny, and Trevor were really uncomfortable. They were supposed to let some worm thing jerk them off while it showed them images of decapitated bodies and stuff. Nick could deal with the nightmares and the cuts, but he wouldn't want to force any of his employees to work with the lover. How often does it have to be worked with? Nick asked. Theoretically, about 10 times a day, which produces a lot of Zephyx. But that also encourages it and increases the pleasure it gives, making the perversion stronger. We worked with it once a day, which seemed a good rate. Compared to the bleeding lady and the dreamer, the lover is only an early hatchling, and it only produces about 5 grams per session, but that should increase as it grows stronger. Nick frowned. He really didn't want to, but as the chief Zephyx Extractor, he had to know how to work with every Specter of Dark Dream. So Nick took a deep breath. "I'll check it out," and walked in. Chapter 176, Not a Problem. Nick walked out of the containment unit into the small locker room. His 4 employees were waiting outside. Right now, Nick was alone. As soon as he entered the locker room, he sat down near a wall and looked at the ground. The mix of emotions was intense. Physically, he felt amazing, but that was exactly what made him feel terrible mentally. It felt disgusting to have such strong feelings for something this horrible. While the lover had been doing its thing, Nick had seen visions of a group of men cutting holes into a limbless torso and fucking them. The vision drew him in, and he almost felt like he had been one of the men. He had been so incredibly disgusted, but it had felt so good. It was horrible. Working with the lover was absolutely horrible. Of all the Specters Dark Dream owned, Nick wanted to work with it the least. He sat on the ground, staring forward with a lifeless expression. He felt like shit. After a while, Nick started thinking about how to deal with the lover. He couldn't possibly force any of his employees to work with it. It was just that bad. Hiring normal people would also be impossible. First, normal humans didn't have the mental fortitude to resist something like the lover. Most likely, after just one session, they'd find their sexual desires irrevocably and permanently changed. Even more, they'd then know about the lover, making it easier for other extractors and manufacturers to plan something. And Nick would feel horrible about the damage. Just for a couple of grams of Zephyx, a life would be destroyed. This was different from feeding the screaming coffin corpses. They purchased those from the city. The corpses weren't created because Dark Dream asked for them. They were simply the corpses of people who died of whatever. Dark Dream buying corpses did not result in new corpses being produced. But with the lover, it would be different. Dark Dream would actively ruin the lives of many people. Extractors had the mental fortitude to resist the lover, but they'd need breaks. Working with it every day was bad. I can't make anyone work with it, Nick thought. I just can't. After more thinking, Nick sighed and left the locker room. When he came out, everyone looked at him with worry and interest. Nick took a deep breath. "It's bad," he said. Trevor and Jenny looked at him with discomfort and fear. "You don't have to work with it," Nick told them, which surprised them. "It's so bad that I can't ask any of you to make this sacrifice. I wouldn't be able to live with myself. If you're desperate for money and really want to take care of it, you may, but I will never ask any of you to go in there. It only produces 5 grams of Zephyx a day. I'd rather not have those than ask you to go through something like this." Kiara and Jonathan were quite surprised. Back in Cycle, Stephen had said working with the lover was a necessary evil and part of the job. Now Nick was saying it wasn't necessary. Jenny and Trevor looked at him with concern, but also relief. What they'd heard about the lover seemed terrifying. "The lover is actually not a problem," Kiara said. Jonathan raised an eyebrow at her. He hadn't expected her to come forward. "What do you mean?" Nick asked. "Well," Kiara said slowly, taking a deep breath, "I was specifically hired to work with the lover back then." Trevor, Jenny, and Nick looked at her with surprise and shock. "During my job interview, Stephen asked me many personal questions. Back then I was quite angry, but I needed the job, so I answered. Then he told me what would happen to me if I accepted." Kiara looked to the side. "I wanted to make something of myself, so I accepted. I've been working with the lover almost every day for about 2 months." The other 4 looked at her with sympathy. "You don't have to do this," Nick said. "I felt firsthand what something like this can do to you." Kiara shook her head. "It doesn't matter anymore. It's too late anyway," she said quietly. The others realized what she meant and felt horrible for her. "I'm already used to it," Kiara said. "The bad part is already there. By now it's just switching from one bad part to another." She took a deep breath. "But the good thing is my job is essentially secure. I'm the only one who can work with it, which gives me a unique position. So it's not all bad," she said more positively. Silence. "But do you want to work with it?" Nick asked with furrowed brows. "What's the alternative?" Kiara asked with a shrug. "Not working with it," Nick said. "That's not a choice." "Yes, it is." "No, it isn't," Kiara answered. "With the 3 new recruits coming will be 7 extractors excluding you. The screaming coffin, the dung heap, and the bleeding lady barely need any work, leaving only the dreamer and the lover. If I don't work with the lover, nobody will. Then what? Am I supposed to fight over the dreamer with 6 other extractors? I'd rather work with the lover, she said with annoyance. Nick looked at her with concern. She refused to look back. In the end, Nick sighed. If that's truly what you want, you're free to do so. But if you need a break or anything, you have to tell me, okay? Kiara furrowed her brows but still didn't look at him. Sure. Chapter 177, First Day. Nick wasn't happy about it, but Kiara had solved the problem with the lover. He just didn't know how to feel. Working with the lover was horrible and would permanently change people into something they'd probably find disgusting. And yet Kiara was willing. It wasn't hard to tell she didn't feel great about it either, but her explanation made sense. She was in a unique position, which made her special and important to Dark Dream. Sadly, there was no way to change the dynamic without literally forcing her not to work with it, also not something Nick wanted to do. That only leaves the dung heap, Nick said. Jonathan nodded. That one isn't troublesome, it's just disgusting. Show us, Nick said. Everyone walked toward the second floor and they could smell the dung heap before they arrived. The entire floor smelled like a garbage dump on a midsummer day. Luckily, everyone present could deal with it. Jonathan and Kiara had been around the dung heap a long time, and the other 3 came from the Dregs, where the pungent smell of the sewers blanketed everything. They'd spent years there. The dung heap only smelled slightly worse. Oh, by the way, do we have food? Jonathan asked. The delivery for the dung heap hasn't been set up yet, Nick said. That might be bad, Jonathan said. Like the bleeding lady, the dung heap needs to be worked with regularly. If it doesn't get its food, it starts getting aggressive. The containment unit is strong enough to hold it, but anyone who enters would get attacked. Nick nodded. It was important to remember the dung heap wasn't truly a possession specter. If it wanted, it could probably attack someone. It might not be the most powerful specter on its level, but as an adolescent it could probably overwhelm a newbie. Maybe it's better we wait until the food delivery is set up then, Nick said. Probably for the better, Jonathan answered. The others agreed. Then let me set up the schedule for who works with what, Nick said. The others nodded. Kiara, you'll work with the lover daily. I'll leave the frequency up to you, but it has to be at least once a day. Yes, boss. The dreamer is worked with by Jenny, Trevor, and Jonathan. The order is up to you, but I want 3 shifts of 8 hours a day. Sure thing, boss, Jenny said with a smile. I'll deliver the food to the dung heap and the corpses to the screaming coffin, and I'll also work with the bleeding lady. From now on, I might only occasionally be in the building, since I also have to set up a team of investigators and search for more specters myself. If there's anything urgent and I'm not here, tell Wintour, but try not to disturb him with matters that can wait until the next day. The others nodded again. That should be everything for today. Starting tomorrow, that's how we proceed, Nick said. After more talking, the group split apart, and Nick went to Wintour to discuss some Dark Dream matters. Wintour told him the food arrangement had actually already been set up, but the deliveries would only start the next day. Nick explained how he'd set up the shifts, and Wintour nodded. But then he added something. Nick, I think you've got this, Wintour said. You don't need to tell me about the Extractors' shifts anymore. You've shown you can manage them. I trust your skills. Just write it down somewhere and give me the schedule in case I need an extractor. With more people and more specters, I can't keep these things in my head anymore. Nick smiled and nodded, of course. Some minutes later, Nick left Wintour's new office and walked through the building again, getting more familiar with it. Eventually, it was time to leave and train with Reynolds. The next day, Nick went into Dark Dream's new building and saw one of the clerks at the front desk. The receptionist greeted him politely and wished him a good morning. Nick talked with her a bit before checking up on the people and the specters. First, Nick went to the second floor. Bang, bang, bang. As soon as he arrived, he heard something heavy hitting one of the walls. It came from the dung heap's containment unit. Guess it really wants some food, Nick thought. The delivery comes at 9 a.m., there shouldn't be an issue. Then Nick checked on the screaming coffin. Still digesting the fat man, he thought, looking at the unmoving specter. He accessed the screaming coffin's Zephyx storage, took the container, and put in a new one. Then he checked the dung heap's container. Nothing as expected. After that, Nick went to the third floor and checked the bleeding lady's container. 65 grams, he thought with surprise. All that cutting yesterday was worth it. He took that container too and entered the fifth floor. The lover's containment unit had 6 grams, what Nick had produced yesterday. He checked the sign at the entrance to see if anyone was inside. She's not here yet. Then Nick went to the dreamer's containment unit. The sign said someone was working with it, as expected. He didn't know who, but it didn't matter. About 12 grams of Zephyx, he thought. Nick changed those containers too and went to the top floor, where he put them in a special location only he and Wintour could access. Then he wrote down how much Zephyx each Specter had produced and left the sheet in Wintour's office. Lastly, Nick went to the third floor and worked with the bleeding lady. There were no issues. For the next couple of hours, Nick thought about how to create and manage a team of inspectors. And finally, the food delivery arrived for the dung heap. Chapter 178, The Dung Heap. "Sir, the food delivery is here," the cute girl from the front desk said, entering Nick's office. As the chief Zephyx Extractor, Nick had his own office on the top floor. "I'll come," Nick said, standing up. The two of them walked down to the first floor, where Nick saw a guy in a sharp suit. He doesn't look like a food delivery man, Nick thought. "Hello, nice to meet you," the guy said, offering his hand. "My name is Braun, and I have a delivery of a bit more than 240 kilos of food waste." Nick shook it. "Nice to meet you. I'm Nick, the chief Zephyx Extractor. No offense, but you don't look like someone who delivers food." Braun laughed. "I completely understand. That's because I'm the middleman. I gather all the food waste from many different providers and sell it." So he's a merchant, Nick thought. That's more in line with how he dresses. A bit later, Braun led Nick outside and showed him a cart. Two men stood in front of it, dirty and muscular compared to Braun. On the cart was a steaming, stinking pile of garbage, eggshells, rotten eggs, bones, insects, rancid meat, rancid cheese. Yet there were no maggots, which meant it was fresh. Nick nodded after looking at the pile. "Thank you. Can I use the cart to transport it?" "You can keep the cart," Braun said. "When I come with the next delivery tomorrow, you give me today's." Nick nodded. "Sounds great, thank you." "Of course," Braun said. After a bit more talking, Braun handed Nick a sheet listing all the food waste and its amount. Nick read through it and signed. Then Braun quickly said his goodbyes and left. Nick didn't need to pay him, since Wintour had a contractual agreement with Braun. He'd simply take the sheet and get his money from Dark Dream's bank account. Nick pulled the stinking pile into Dark Dream and walked to the stairs. That was when he realized he had a problem. How would he get 240 kilos of waste up the stairs? He could lift that, but the cart was big and cumbersome. Eventually, Nick got the cart onto the staircase and closed the door behind him. His ability activated. Then he easily lifted it over his head and ran up the stairs, setting it down on the second floor and opening the door. Well, that works, Nick thought. Bang, bang. The walls of the dung heap's containment unit were still shaking. Nick walked into the locker room in front of it and readied himself. Slowly, he opened the employee door. Whum, whum, whum. Immediately, the alarm rang. While the containment unit could isolate Specters from going through the opened employee entrance, it used Zephyx to do so, which was the reason for the alarm. Nick watched through a blue force field as the dung heap tried to get through the opened entrance. It completely covered the ground of the 5x5 meter containment unit and was nearly 2 meters high at its peak. And it looked strange, like a rancid, decaying pile of garbage, but Nick couldn't identify a single specific piece. It was like looking at a mass of people and not being able to point out one face. Right now, the dung heap swayed back and forth like a viscous liquid. With each sway, it gathered strength and rammed the force field of the open door. Surprisingly, even though Nick was looking at the dung heap, his ability was still active. Apparently, the dung heap couldn't see or hear. Nick grabbed some handfuls of garbage and chucked them into the containment unit. Bang! The garbage ball exploded on the far side and fell onto the dung heap. "Stop complaining, I got your food right here," Nick shouted, throwing in another handful of food. A low rumbling noise came from the dung heap, and it started to shake a bit. It slowly stopped moving and the alarm stopped. Nick chucked a couple more balls of garbage in before grabbing the cart and lifting it. Earlier, the dung heap had blocked most of the employee entrance. If Nick had dumped the entire cart there, it would have tried even harder to get out, since the garbage would have been just past the barrier. Nick pulled the cart back before shoving it forward. Splash! A huge pile of garbage fell from the cart. The pile shook again, releasing its deep vibrating sound. "I guess it's happy," Nick thought. Next, the surface of the dung heap began to move, spreading the garbage across the entire containment unit. "It seems to have calmed down," Nick thought. Then he lifted the cart and walked into the unit. As his feet stepped onto the dung heap, he felt like he was walking on a humongous, fat person. There was a lot of give, but he didn't really sink. The dung heap was one entity. It just looked like a huge pile of trash. Inside the containment unit, Nick dumped the cart onto the dung heap. His ability had deactivated once he stepped onto it, but the cart had become much lighter by then. In a couple of seconds, Nick emptied it and walked out. The dung heap released a couple more deep murmurs while moving the trash around. After exiting, Nick closed the door and put the cart at one end of the locker room. Then he sighed. It seems easy enough to manage, Nick thought. It hadn't been fed for several days, which made it problematic, but I think it won't be an issue starting tomorrow. Chapter 179, 6 months later. Nick stood in front of a door on the third floor of Dark Dream and sighed. He was not looking forward to this. His big, muscular hand pushed open the door to the locker room, and he entered. It had been 6 months since Dark Dream moved to this building, and Nick had recently turned 17. Over the last few months, not much had happened. He taught his 3 new colleagues and focused on day-to-day matters. One of those had been establishing an investigator team and searching for the next Specter. The team had been fully formed about 4 months ago, and Dark Dream's profits shrank a lot as a result. They hired over 20 investigators, mostly focused on the Dregs. Paying so many highly skilled people was not cheap. But it had been worth it. The investigators found the trace of a Specter, and Dark Dream captured it. Surprisingly, capturing it had been rather easy due to its nature, but it had still been incredibly painful. Mainly for Nick. And now it was time for him to find out how to work with the Specter. He already had a good idea, but he needed to confirm it and check how much Zephyx it produced. The good thing was that the Specter was already a peak hatchling, since its identity had been a secret for a long time. Many people knew and had met it, but none had suspected it was one. The investigators only noticed something might be wrong when they stopped looking for anything specific and just started combining information and clues. One of these clues was the abundance of weakness and sickness in the Dregs. Due to the dirty, unclean environment, getting sick wasn't unusual, and the blood tax made sure nearly everyone felt weak. So nobody had thought to cross-reference the sick and weak people. Nevertheless, the investigators did. After a lot of gathering, they found something. While the sickness was evenly spread across the Dregs, the weak people mostly concentrated around one block of houses. For several days, the investigators watched the block and interviewed people, yet it was impossible to find the Specter. And then the investigators stationed there started to feel weak. At that point, they were certain they were onto a Specter. That was when Nick got involved and searched too, but nobody could find it. And then Nick started to feel extremely weak, while bizarrely the investigators regained their strength. So did the normal people. And finally, they found out what had been going on. Animals were common in the Dregs. Rats, wild dogs, cats, raccoons, plenty of insects. And this particular group of houses had one as a pet, a dirty but cute puppy. It didn't belong to anyone in particular and was cared for by the community. When the investigators arrived, they played with it from time to time. And when Nick appeared, the puppy immediately took a liking to him and begged to be hugged. Nick did, basically carrying it around while he was there. When Nick finally got sick, many people realized it was the puppy. It had been with him for several days by then. Nick quickly took it away after contacting the other extractors. Yet when the puppy noticed several strong people surrounding it, its behavior changed. It started to whine pitifully. At that point, Nick felt like chunks of his insides were being torn out. The group put a Zephyx suppressor on the puppy, but it still managed to hurt people through the suppressor, albeit with less intensity. After dumping the puppy into the containment unit, Nick went home to recover. It was bad, real bad. His heart beat without rhythm and he kept going in and out of consciousness. He sweated bullets while feeling extremely cold and hot. He even puked blood a couple of times. It took almost 2 full days to recover. Of course, Nick wanted to go to the hospital, but he couldn't risk unveiling the nature of their newest Specter. He was fairly sure he'd survive due to his high regeneration. And he did. But now it was time to work with the puppy. Fittingly, Nick decided to call the Specter the puppy. I'm pretty sure the puppy gains power by converting people's vitality into Zephyx, which is quite different from getting injured or exerting myself. This kind of damage is much harder to repair and much more chaotic since it's all over my body. I'm also not sure whether there's a manipulative factor since nobody seems able to resist the puppy's charm. Everyone there wanted to hug and hold it. Then again, it could just be very cute. But even if there is a manipulation aspect, I want to be sure, so I'll leave it here. If any employees start asking me or the other extractors about the new Specter, I'll know for certain. Next, Nick thought about how to find out how to work with the puppy. Should he just stay by its side or provoke the crying? He didn't know, and it was his job to find out. That was what a chief Zephyx Extractor was supposed to do. Nick took a deep breath and entered the containment unit. Chapter 180, The Puppy. After opening the door, Nick looked at the other end of the containment unit with an uncertain expression. In one corner was a perfectly white and fluffy little dog. Funnily enough, the dog had been dirty the whole time in the dregs, but as soon as it arrived here, all the dirt vanished. Most likely a camouflaging ability, Nick thought, taking another deep breath. The puppy lay on the ground, whimpering silently. The sound made Nick feel like his heart was being torn apart. The poor thing, was it in pain? However, Nick kept his mind under control and kept telling himself that this was a Specter. The puppy might be fluffy, white, cute, adorable. He had to stay in control. Nick wanted to do nothing but walk over to hug and comfort it. He just wanted to tell it everything was going to be okay, but he kept himself in check. The puppy slowly turned its big, wet eyes to look at Nick. Nick took yet another deep breath and stayed still. The puppy whimpered a bit and slowly walked closer. Then it stumbled over its feet and fell with an adorable little yelp, but it quickly stood again and moved toward Nick, its tail wagging slowly and carefully. There was hope, begging, and loneliness in its eyes. Nick took another deep breath. For now, I should see how much Zephyx it produces the normal way, he thought. As soon as he thought about spending time with the puppy, he felt excited and giddy. Yet he kept telling himself this was a Specter and he had to be careful. Nick kneeled and slowly extended his hand. The puppy came closer and sniffed it. Finally, it rubbed its head against his hand in happiness. Nick felt like his heart was melting. It was just so adorable. He slowly picked it up and held it in his arms. Then he walked to one of the walls, sat down, and combed the puppy's fur with his fingers. It gave off sounds of happiness and closed its eyes in pleasure. Nick felt calm inside. It was so difficult for him to feel calm in his life. The finality and pointlessness of his future still weighed heavily on him, and whenever he had a quiet moment, his mind automatically went back to it. There generally was no such thing as calm for Nick. Either he was doing something or he was worrying about something. But here with the puppy, Nick felt calm. He felt content. It was so nice to be with it. At that moment, the door opened, and Nick looked over in surprise. "Boss," Jenny asked. "Yes. You asked me to get you after 8 hours. "Yes, I did," Nick said, still petting the puppy. "Silence. 8 hours are over," she said. Nick's eyes widened in shock. What, hadn't he just sat down? "Are you serious?" Nick asked. "Yes, boss, I'm serious," she said urgently. "It's been 8 hours. Nick took a deep breath and looked at the puppy, which looked at Jenny with curiosity and happiness. "I gotta go," Nick told it, slowly setting it down. The puppy begged him to stay with its whimpers. Nick felt terrible leaving it alone, but he knew it was just a Specter. After some promises to come back, he left the containment unit, and Jenny closed the door behind him. In the locker room, Nick took a deep breath. And that was when he felt his insides shake. Nick was all too familiar with this feeling. He'd felt it many times while living in the dregs. It was the feeling of not having eaten anything for a long time, weakness and loss of control as his limbs started to shake. On top of that, a headache was coming on. Luckily, it wasn't nearly as strong as when the puppy had whimpered. "Boss, everything okay?" Jenny asked. "It's fine," Nick said. "I just feel weak. It's the effect of the Specter. If anyone on your team works with it, another person must force them to leave. While I was in there, it felt like only 10 minutes had passed. You have to instruct your people and make absolutely certain they don't spend more than the allotted time with it." "I'll tell them, boss," Jenny said. About 4 months ago, Nick had made Jenny the team leader of Dark Dream's one and only team of Zephyx Extractors. He wanted to make Trevor team leader, but Winter said Trevor had to stay on the down low since he'd one day become their spy and underground agent, and a team leader was too conspicuous. So Nick made Jenny team leader. She'd done an excellent job, her team liked her, and there had been no incidents. "Let's check how much Zephyx we produced," Nick said, walking out of the locker room with uncertain steps. Jenny followed. After retrieving the container, Nick raised an eyebrow. "About 9 grams, not bad. I think we got a good one this time." "That's quite a lot," Jenny said. Nick nodded. "I want to test something. Larry is still a mid-newbie, right?" Jenny nodded. "I want him to work 8 hours with the puppy tomorrow. I'll instruct him on what to do. I suspect the amount of Zephyx produced isn't dependent on the puppy's level but on the extractor's level. I want someone on a lower level than me to work with it. Of course, I'll stay beside him the entire time." Jenny nodded. I'll tell him to go to your office tomorrow." The next day, Larry worked with the puppy for 8 hours, and as expected, it only produced about 4 grams of Zephyx. The day after, Nick tested how much the whimpering puppy produced. The result was abysmal. After getting quite injured, he didn't find a single gram in the container. Some days of experimenting later, Nick finalized the method for working with the puppy. The extractor just had to spend a couple of hours petting it. The maximum time was set to 6 hours, or the extractor wouldn't recover by the next workday. Only peak newbies were allowed to work with it. Lastly, the next person scheduled had to force the person inside to leave punctually at all costs. If they refused, the team leader or chief Zephyx Extractor had to be informed immediately. This was the first time Nick had figured out how to work with a Specter truly on his own, without any help, and it worked. By now, Nick had become fully used to being the chief Zephyx Extractor of Dark Dream, and Dark Dream was making a shitload of credits. Chapter 181, 18. Nick walked down the lonely street of the abandoned Dregs. This part had nearly nobody living in it at most, some people trying to avoid the blood tax by hiding. Some actually managed it, but they were the minority. Only those who couldn't afford to lose another 2 liters of blood would try that stunt. If they were going to die with the next tax anyway, they might as well take their chances. Aside from them, there was basically no one. The streets were completely ruined, and walking on them was extremely dangerous. Nick had been walking through them for several days now, only leaving once a day to do his duties in Dark Dream and to sleep. He had recently turned 18, and he was finally ready to become a level 2 extractor. A couple of days ago, Nick had felt some kind of energy inside his body ready to explode. That was the sign of an extractor ready to break through. All they needed was to come into contact with an adolescent Specter and have that energy explode forward. At that point, they'd reach the next level while mutating their ability with the adolescent Specter's support. Without contact with a fitting Specter, reaching the next level was impossible. Nick could just come into contact with the dung heap, also an adolescent Specter, but he didn't want that ability. It didn't seem to fit the Null's ability very well. So Nick was trying to come into contact with a new Specter, one he had known for almost 2 years. Back then, Wintour had used it as an example for the category of 4 Specters. The Fog. The Fog was a known Specter that lived in the abandoned Dregs inside Crimson Fungus City. Many people knew about it, but the bigger manufacturers weren't interested in capturing it. The issue was that, as a 4 Specter, it was very difficult to catch and contain. The containment unit necessary was so insanely expensive it might take years for the Specter to pay it off. 25 million credits, that was the price of the containment unit. Something like the Fog would, at most, produce 50 grams of Zephyx a day, about 50,000 credits. Assuming no associated costs and 100% of the Zephyx went to repaying the unit, it would still take 500 days. And since Dark Dream only got to keep 60% of the Zephyx, it would take even longer. Now, if the Fog were an adult Specter, things would be different. It would definitely produce over 100 grams a day, and they could still buy the same containment unit. The units for 4 Specters weren't built for weak Specters, since it wasn't really profitable. The materials needed to contain an adult Specter barely made up 10% of the price. The containment unit Wintour had bought had consumed an entire year of Dark Dream's profits, and he'd even needed to take out a loan. But for Nick, he was willing to pay that price. Nick had been an excellent chief Zephyx Extractor, and Wintour fully trusted him. Naturally, Wintour wouldn't waste such a great employee. He'd continue investing in Nick so he could reach his full potential. The plan to capture the Fog had been created over a year ago. Both of them realized the Fog's ability had a great affinity with Nick's. On top of that, the Fog wasn't an incredibly powerful Specter in battle. 4 Specters like it almost exclusively fought with their abilities, since they didn't really have bodies to punch with. But in turn, capturing them was insanely difficult. Nick knew capturing the Fog was not a given. He'd get his ability either way, since he only needed to come into contact with the Specter. But failing to catch, it would mean Dark Dream's investment went up in flames. So there was still a lot of pressure on his shoulders. As Nick walked through the empty, damaged streets, he looked around with sharp eyes. By now, Nick had reached a height of about 185 centimeters, most likely where his growth would stop. He hadn't been very tall before becoming a Zephyx Extractor, and it had seemed he wouldn't grow tall. However, Zephyx was essentially pure energy, and the body needed energy and nutrients to grow. The Zephyx Nick had come into contact with had let his body grow to a respectable height. Due to his brutal training, he had also grown frighteningly muscular, his body almost identical to Reynolds. Any more muscle and Nick's speed and flexibility would suffer. He was perfectly on the border between too little and too much. He was so athletic he could carry all 5 of his spears and his fist weapons while still jumping with agility. Nevertheless, Nick still only carried 3 spears, not wanting too much of a speed disadvantage. Nick had stopped training with Reynolds and Mainla a couple of months ago. Both had essentially taught him everything they knew about wielding their weapons. Now, he only needed actual practice in real scenarios. They were extremely impressed by Nick. Reynolds had even said something surprising. "You do know you're actually experienced and strong enough to join Blitz, right? I could request an interview, and you join my team within the week." However, Nick declined. Wintour had never betrayed him and had invested so much in him. Nick wouldn't leave him like that. Chapter 182, The Fog. Nick kept walking down the streets with heavy, powerful steps, looking around carefully. The last time someone had been reported missing was about a month ago, and as far as everyone knew, the fog took about a month to consume a human. People weren't completely certain what the fog did. They only knew it took someone and came back a month later for someone else. The specific way it killed its victims was unknown. They just walked into the fog and vanished. Naturally, Nick felt some apprehension. The unknown was quite scary, but he was willing to take the risk. His future was worth it. Nick walked from one alleyway to another, taking the same route he'd taken for days. Nothing special was happening, but he was quite sure he'd meet the fog soon. 3 days ago, one of Nick's old friends had visited him. Julian, the expert Zephyx Extractor who had talked with Nick a day before he met Reynolds. Julian talked with him about his problems for a while and asked what he had planned. Nick told him about the fog. There was no need for secrecy, since everyone basically knew about it and nobody was willing to spend the credits to capture it. When Julian heard that, he smiled slyly and told Nick which route to take. He'd seen the fog a couple of times and had been one of the extractors who created its profile. As always, Julian knew what he was talking about, and he was a pleasure to be around. Everyone liked Julian. Ever since Nick had been following this route, Nick trusted Julian, and Julian wouldn't betray his trust. During the evening, Nick noticed it became more difficult to find his way forward, like his sight was being obscured by a veil. Usually he'd think it was normal fog, but since he was specifically searching for the fog, he knew chances were high this was the Specter. His heart rate increased and his breathing quickened, but he did his best to appear calm. Nick wanted to be enveloped by the fog. It might flee if he attacked, so he just kept walking forward. Eventually, he couldn't see anything anymore. The gray fog was so thick he couldn't even see his own hands. He could feel his hand touch his face, but he couldn't see it, even when he lightly touched his eyeball. It was almost like he didn't have a body, like he was only a consciousness drifting through an empty void. Yet Nick could still feel his body. When he punched his left arm with his right, he still felt the impact and the pain. He could feel himself walking forward, but the floor had changed. It made no sound now. He couldn't even hear his own steps, and it felt very even a bit soft like a featureless carpet. And there were no walls whatsoever. Earlier he'd been walking through the abandoned Dregs houses everywhere. Now, no matter which direction he walked, he wouldn't touch anything. It was like his body had left the world. So this is what it does, Nick thought with narrowed eyes. Since he was now well and truly captured, Nick decided to fight back and started to run. He sprinted with all his strength and jumped from side to side. He was running at incredible speeds but still couldn't touch anything. Then he threw one of his spears into the distance. The ghost wire quickly tensed, and he let the spear fall to the ground far off. It hadn't hit anything. Nick walked over, picked it up, and put it back on his back. It's like this world is limitless, Nick thought. I have no idea where I am, and I can't even reach the outside world by throwing a spear. I'm no longer in Crimson Fungus City. At least, that's what I'd think if I didn't know anything about Specters. This is only an adolescent, and I'm certain it doesn't have the power to transport me out of the city just like that. It would have to be an elder at the very least, and even then it would be unlikely. So I must still be inside Crimson Fungus City. At most, it created a temporary domain that imitates an alien world. Keeping this domain active is probably consuming Zephyx, but it's also most likely producing more than it uses. I can run and jump around as much as I want and I won't get out. The only way is to make it consume more Zephyx than it produces. That means I need to tear the world around me apart and destabilize the domain. The best way is to just use a lot of power. A moment later, Nick pulled out his fist weapons. Bang, 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 bang. Nick started to rampage through his surroundings, kicking and punching everything. While he did, he watched his surroundings. That was when he noticed something. After a particularly fast kick, The guard on his shin had pulled the fog to the side a bit, revealing a small afterimage of a darker area, but it immediately closed again. Wintour told me my weapons can also interact with force specters, which is why they were so insanely expensive, and sure enough, he was right. Without them, I probably couldn't break through the fog, but I'm certain this isn't enough power to do it. Nick narrowed his eyes, and my ability isn't active. The fog could perceive Nick, which meant he was only as strong as a peak newbie, though with his body, he probably had the power of an average initial John. If I want to break out, I have to get my ability to activate. Let's hope the fog's ability is good enough. Chapter 183, Hatchlings. For a while longer, Nick kept punching and kicking the air. He knew it wouldn't help, but he wanted to know what the fog actually did. He'd most likely need to work with it in the future, so he might as well learn about it now, since it wasn't in a hurry to kill him. From time to time, Nick managed to push the fog aside, revealing a darker place behind the bright gray. By the looks of it, he wasn't somewhere with a lot of sunlight. The fog wasn't strong enough to completely transport him into a parallel dimension, so he had to be somewhere in Crimson Fungus City. Nick wasn't sure how much time passed, but he started to get hungry. Surprisingly, even though he'd moved around a lot, he didn't get thirsty. The fog is probably moisturizing my body, so I need no water. Based on the clear color of the piss I just took, it gives me quite a lot of water too. That's a healthy amount. However, there's no food. Is that how it kills its victims? It traps them in an endless world of gray until they starve. I wonder if that's how it becomes stronger or if it's just corpses. No, probably not corpses, or it wouldn't feed me water. Most likely, slowly starving inside its domain is what it gains power from. Now, is it perpetually gaining power while I'm in here, or does it only get a burst when I die? This was an important question. If the fog perpetually produced Zephyx from someone walking through its domain, working with it would be easy. Just send a Zephyx Extractor in and take them out after a while. But if it only got the power after actually killing people through starvation, Nick had a problem. He couldn't ask any of his Extractors to work with it. Even more, he'd need to search for criminals or something. He couldn't imagine sending random people to their deaths. I can't be sure, but I think it produces Zephyx during the process of being lost. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been confident enough to trap me, since I'd have plenty of time to exhaust its Zephyx supply. Nick decided to stay inside the fog for 2 more hours to see whether it would unveil another aspect of itself. But nothing happened. His head was still clear, and even though he was sweaty from all the exertion, his stamina had already recovered, which meant the fog wasn't isolating the prefix, so Nick could heal and recover while lost in it. That's probably not something it can do yet, but I'd imagine it can learn something like that in the future. After all, veterans don't need to eat or drink, since the prefix in the atmosphere nourishes them. If a veteran were lost in here, they'd never die. Maybe the fog will one day learn to isolate prefix. Scientists were sure most Specters were born as hatchlings, which meant the fog had once been one too. They reached that conclusion after finding buried data depicting a bloody room with 2 people fighting in it, and pictures of a bloody coliseum with teeth at its edges and several people fighting inside. The scientists were quite certain these had been iterations of the Maw, one of the Eternals. According to history, the Maw had once started out as just a random room, eventually used as some sort of arena. At some point, humanity lost control over it, and it became the terror it was today. If the Maw had once been a hatchling, chances were high almost all Specters had once been hatchlings, except for one. The oldest Specter known to humanity was the Sun, and as far as anyone had heard, it had always been there. The Sun was probably the only Specter that hadn't been a hatchling. As a hatchling, the fog probably didn't have the ability to nourish someone with water, which meant it would need new victims quicker. Nick was building a profile on the fog. It was his job, and the more he knew about his Specters, the better. Seeing that nothing was changing, Nick decided to become active. First, he wanted to try if the locator worked. Naturally, he'd come prepared, knowing he'd meet the fog. He pulled a small rod out of one of his pockets, flipped it open, pulled out a couple of legs, placed it on the ground, and pressed a button. The tip started to slowly shine yellow, meaning it was starting up. For a couple of seconds, Nick watched the yellow light. And then the light suddenly turned red. Nick just furrowed his brow. That's to be expected, I suppose. The red light meant a foreign force of Zephyx was interfering with the signal. The locator worked by spreading a special kind of Zephyx that could be picked up by certain instruments, but the presence of the Specter kept the Zephyx from spreading. It was like a big man surrounding a small mouse with his hand. The mouse couldn't move out, since it was all around it and it wasn't strong enough to break through. I might be able to escape on my own with the new ability I'm about to obtain, but I can't expect to capture the fog on my own. I need the help of Dark Dream, and for that, I need to activate the locator. I guess it's time to advance and get my new ability. Chapter 184, John. Nick sat down and closed his eyes. This would be his first advancement, and he wanted to make sure nothing went wrong. He imagined himself pulling something out from deep inside. Almost immediately, he felt himself becoming hotter and broke out in sweat. All the Zephyx his body had prepared for the breakthrough was being accessed and burned. His muscles began to shake, and he felt his heart beating in his ear. His face turned red and he grimaced with strain. His breathing deepened. The next moment, Nick felt something new appear inside his body. It was a strange sensation, like something blue and calm was expanding inside him. As the blue force spread through his torso, he felt like he was bathing in the recovery bath again. So relaxing. But at the same time, his confidence shot through the roof, and he felt like he had the ability to tear reality apart. Nick took a very deep breath and the blue force exploded, encompassing his entire body. He kept breathing in without end. It was almost like all the air he inhaled was vanishing. He kept inhaling and inhaling, but his chest almost didn't expand. The more he inhaled, the more he wanted to jump around and punch something. He was so full of energy. Half a minute later, Nick stopped inhaling. His muscles flexed on their own, and he felt like he could punch a house into dust. At that point, the strange things happening to his body stopped. Naturally, Nick knew what that meant. I advanced. I'm a level 2 Zephyx Extractor now. Finally, I'm a John. Nick jumped to his feet with ease, even though he still carried his weapons. Bang, bang, bang. Nick started to rapidly punch and kick the air again. This time, the dark afterimage of his real surroundings appeared more frequently and clearer. But the next moment, the afterimages changed. Several corpses were looking at Nick through the gaps in the fog. It was like he was surrounded by corpses that just kept staring at him. That's troublesome, Nick thought with furrowed brows. I think I know where I am. Nick was quite certain the corpses weren't real. They were just illusions, created by the nightmare. He was sure he was surrounded by the fog, which was surrounded by darkness. Specters didn't suffer from the effects of the nightmare, so it could simply be there. And it seemed to have the ability to isolate Nick from the nightmare's influence. Yet as soon as he created small gaps in the fog, the nightmare's influence could enter, producing these images of corpses watching him. Either I'm in some kind of room or I'm in the sewers. I can't be entirely sure, Nick thought. All of Nick's hunger and exhaustion vanished after he turned into a John, and he took advantage of it, launching an assault on his surroundings. Due to his impressive body, his base strength was probably already at the level of an average early John, maybe even mid-John. He didn't know the fog's exact level, which was why he was trying to break through it. Disciplined and athletic, he could launch a perfect barrage of brutal attacks for an extended time. If he managed to exhaust the fog completely, it was probably only an initial or early adolescent. But if it kept resisting, it was probably a mid, late, or peak adolescent. Over the next hours, Nick created many gaps through which he saw images that seemed to come from hell. Yet the fog kept returning to its old form again and again. It didn't matter how much he punched and kicked. It seemed to have no use. Even when he created a gap and pushed his arm through, the fog just closed in front of it again. While doing all this, Nick kept an eye on the locator. The red light sometimes got weaker but always stayed red. That meant the amount of foreign Zephyx isolating the signal sometimes reduced but never really vanished. Eventually, Nick stopped and sat down again. No use, he thought with a sigh. I'm sure I've attacked it for over an hour and it doesn't behave any differently from the start. It can probably withstand my attacks forever. Nick gulped as his nervousness increased. He'd been prepared for this, but he still felt nervous. His survival now depended on the ability he'd acquired. If Nick's mutated ability could activate the effect of the null's ability, he'd be able to escape. If not, his chances of survival would be slim. Dark Dream knew Nick was captured by the fog somewhere and was searching for him. Yet the chances of them finding him without the locator were slim. Not even Nick had managed to find the fog after days of searching. Nick closed his eyes and willed fog to appear from within him. The moment of truth had arrived. What kind of ability had Nick unlocked? Would he be able to create fog around him? Could he create fog somewhere else? Did his attacks attain some kind of steam effect? Could he manipulate water? Many different mutations could have appeared, and he didn't know which one he'd received. What would his ability be? Would it be useful? Would it help him in this scenario? As Nick willed the fog to appear, he noticed the blue force inside him again. Apparently it hadn't vanished after his breakthrough, but now it was reducing rapidly. Within less than a second, all of it vanished. And Nick's mutated ability activated. Chapter 185, Mutated Ability. Nick couldn't see what was happening due to all the fog, but he could feel his null ability activating. This meant the fog couldn't perceive him anymore. Nick immediately jumped to his feet and released a terrifying kick. Nothing. The fog showed no reaction. It was almost like Nick hadn't attacked at all. He released several more attacks, but the fog just didn't react. The next moment, Nick willed his ability to stop. The blue force appeared inside his chest again and returned to normal within less than a second. At the same time, his ability deactivated. Bang! Nick unleashed a kick, and the fog finally reacted again. He furrowed his brows. It sucks that I can't see my body right now. I want to know what's happening. I should try some more. Nick experimented with his new ability a couple of times. Whoosh! Suddenly, a huge gap appeared in the fog, and Nick's eyes widened. He had activated his new ability, and while unleashing an attack, deactivated it again. By now, Nick had noticed both his abilities activated and deactivated at the same time. When his new ability was active, his old one was too. But his old ability wasn't active when his new one wasn't. This meant the new ability hid him from the fog's perception, but when it deactivated, the fog perceived him again. Yet kinetic energy and inertia were a thing. If Nick unleashed an attack with his ability active and deactivated it, the attack would still have the kinetic energy from when it was active. That was how he'd managed such a strong attack just now. His eyes narrowed, and he immediately unleashed more attacks. The more he activated and deactivated his ability, the more familiar he became with it. By now, the activation and deactivation times were barely 0.1 seconds. This meant Nick could attack the fog as if his ability were active. It took a bit of practice, but he got pretty good at it. Bang, bang, bang. Nick kept hitting the fog in front of him, and the gaps grew larger. The light on top of the locator changed from red to a weak red to a weak green. Seeing that, Nick felt even more energized and continued attacking. By now, each attack created a huge gap. If he were fast enough, he could probably jump through and escape. But there were two problems. First, the nightmare was the ruler of the world in front of him. Second, Nick didn't want the fog to retreat. Sure, he was powerful and could escape, but he was certain he could neither kill nor contain it. It would be like catching smoke with his hands. This was the problem with 4 Specters. They didn't have bodies to fight with, but they were insanely difficult to catch, kill, and suppress. So Nick just kept kicking and punching at the same opening he'd already created. He needed his locator to stay active. The longer it did, the further its signal would spread. For over an hour, Nick kept attacking the same spot. By now, he started to feel exhausted. How long are they going to take? Slowly, the gap grew smaller since Nick couldn't keep attacking with all his power. About 90 minutes after he started, he stopped and sat down. The fog closed around him again, and he breathed heavily. He was completely exhausted. At least he'd gotten more familiar with his new ability, even though he still couldn't tell exactly what it did. He only knew it could hide him from the fog's perception. I'll continue later, he thought. For about an hour, Nick recovered his strength. Then he continued attacking the fog and creating an opening. 90 minutes later, he had to take a break again. By now, he was getting tired. He'd been awake a while and done a lot of exercise. Should I sleep? Nick thought. He really didn't like that idea. What if the fog attacked him while he slept? What if it had some ability to poison him with gas during his sleep? I suspect it probably won't, but I'm not willing to take that risk outside a containment unit. I have to continue. Nick stood again and continued punching and kicking. The world behind the fog was just as terrifying as at the start. Luckily, it couldn't enter the fog's world. In a way, the fog was protecting Nick from the nightmare. Nick wanted to know where he was, but he had no idea since the nightmare kept changing everything around him. He could be in a tiny dark closet or in the sewers. Only one thing was certain. It was dark, dark enough to allow the nightmare to use all its power. Nick was getting weak again, and he wasn't sure how long he'd need to rest this time. Moving his body had become very difficult due to all the accumulated exhaustion. Nick. Nick felt like he'd heard someone calling him, but that could just be the nightmare. Then the color of the gap changed. From a red and black hell, it turned into an evening yellow. At that moment, Nick could finally see where he was. He was on top of a tall structure within the sewers. Nick changed the angle of his attacks and created a gap diagonally above him. There, he saw a big hole with several people looking through it. It was the people from Dark Dream. "Are you all right, Nick?" Winter shouted through the hole. "I'm good," Nick shouted back through heavy breaths. Nick could see Winter through the gap, looking concerned. "You don't look all right," Winter said. "You keep switching between blurry and normal." Chapter 186, Repelling Cell. "I'm turning blurry," Nick asked through his attacks. "Yes," Winter shouted. "You turn blurry for a very small instant before you turn solid again." "That should be my ability," Nick shouted back. "But more importantly, what about the repelling cell?" "We got it," Winter shouted. "We're going to prepare it, but it might take several hours. You can rest for a while." "Okay, good," Nick shouted back. "I'll come out again in a couple of hours." Then Nick stopped attacking the fog and all the gaps closed. He immediately sat down and heaved heavily. He was so insanely exhausted, and he was getting hungry again. His breakthrough had only temporarily filled his hunger. Fortunately, Nick didn't feel as nervous anymore. The people of Dark Dream had found him, and he only needed to wait. Luckily, the fog wasn't really a conscious specter, as shown by its passiveness. Any intelligent being would have noticed Nick could have escaped after activating his ability. The fact that he didn't leave meant it would most likely be a bad idea to keep containing him. If the fog were intelligent, it would have let go and run. Even more, the discussion between Nick and Winter was a dead giveaway that something was going to happen to it. The fog's intelligence seemed to be about on the level of the screaming coffin. Maybe even less. So Dark Dream had all the time in the world to build something. For the next couple of hours, Nick waited and recovered. He was so hungry and tired, but he couldn't sleep yet. They had to capture the fog first. Eventually, Nick stood and attacked his surroundings again. "We need 2 more hours," Trevor shouted as soon as he saw the gap. "Okay," Nick shouted back before stopping. He'd just seen over 5 of Dark Dream's extractors working on a platform beside the fog. Many metallic grates and plates had been bent into supportive beams. The hole in the ceiling of the sewers had also been expanded a lot, and Nick had seen several broken walls behind it. The fog is probably below some big building in the outer city. By the looks of it, Winter probably purchased the building and demolished most of it to make the hole, Nick thought. Nick took a deep breath and sat down. The more time passed, the harder it was to wait. He just wanted to eat something and sleep. Sleeping felt so tempting, but he wanted to be certain nothing would happen to him, and he'd most likely sleep for more than just 2 hours. After some time, Nick unleashed some attacks to check on everyone. "We'll start in 30 minutes, Trevor shouted when he saw Nick kicking the fog again. "Okay." Nick stopped and waited. He'd just seen the platform already constructed, everyone testing its stability, several people punching the walls and jumping up and down. It was important the platform was very sturdy. The repelling cell was a heavy hunk of hard metal, weighing over a ton. Nick prepared himself for 30 minutes. And then it was finally time. Nick unleashed some attacks again, and he saw it. On a platform beside the fog was a massive black cube. Many light blue tubes and wires ran through its walls, and there were 4 big cylinders filled with white liquid behind it. "We're ready," Winter shouted from outside the hole. "We're going to activate the repelling cage." A second later, Winter nodded toward his employees on the platform. Trevor stood near the console of the repelling cell and nodded back. Trevor activated the repelling cell, and it gave off a deep, powerful hum. The light blue tubes and wires turned white, and the cell began to shine. At the same time, the white liquid in the cylinders on the back lowered. That liquid was pure Zephyx. Every cylinder held a full kilo of it. These 4 cylinders alone were worth 4 million credits. "Okay, you can bring it inside now," Winter shouted at Nick. Nick nodded and narrowed his eyes. Then he took tiny steps forward while launching attacks. When there were no gaps in the fog, Nick couldn't move in the real world, no matter how far he ran inside the fog's world. But with several big gaps, he could move in the real world. Somewhat. It was still a bit awkward. Nick kicked open a hole and moved his hand slowly toward the opening while walking forward just a bit. The fog needed to close behind his hand and body, which made it move backward just a tiny bit. If he directly jumped out, the fog would probably fly away and vanish. Slowly, over a couple of minutes, Nick advanced to the edge of the ruin he was on. Then he continued. A minute later, he was mostly on the platform Dark Dream had built. He was directly in front of the repelling cell. He kept advancing, and 2 minutes later he was already inside the big cell. When he reached the back wall, he stopped and opened a gap behind him so he could talk to the people of Dark Dream. He saw almost all his extractors smiling with excitement. "We're going to transport you with the fog," Jenny shouted. "In 2 hours you can come out." "Okay," Nick shouted before he stopped attacking. Outside, everyone looked at Wintour. "Activate it," he told Trevor. Trevor nodded and pressed a big red button on the repelling cell. Then it activated. Chapter 187, Elevated Status. While Nick rested inside the fog's domain, Trevor activated the repelling cell. Whum! Immediately, the hum became many times louder and some extractors held their ears. The wires and tubes turned an iridescent white, and the cell seemingly turned white. Inside, the white light pushed the fog toward the center. At that moment, the fog realized something was going on and tried to flee. It moved in a random direction, but could only go about 10 centimeters before it couldn't proceed. It tried all the other directions, but the same thing happened. It was almost like it was surrounded by thick, durable wool. It could push into the wool, but at some point the resistance was greater than the force the fog could use. This effect was produced by the Zephyx running through the cell. Just as the fog had suppressed the locator with its own Zephyx, it was now suppressed by the repelling cell with its own. Like the locator, the fog tried to expand outward but couldn't force its way through the overwhelmingly dense Zephyx around it. The walls, ceiling, and floor of the cell couldn't be touched by the fog at all. In the end, the fog turned into a smaller cube inside the bigger cube. At this moment, Nick's feet were outside the fog since it couldn't touch the floor. Luckily, humans were immune to the effect of the repelling cage. In fact, almost all physical and possession specters were immune too. The Zephyx of the cell was simply denser than the fog's body, but its density couldn't compare to a human body. For Nick, walking through the Zephyx was marginally harder than walking through air, but nowhere near as hard as walking through water. When Nick felt his feet come into contact with dry instead of moist air, he knew the repelling cell was working. On the outside, the people saw the white light becoming stronger and weaker in different places. This showed that something inside was trying to escape, but that was to be expected. "Get it back to Dark Dream," Wintour commanded. The Zephyx Extractors nodded and jumped onto the platform. It shook a bit but held. 3, 2, 1, Jenny counted down. Then 4 people lifted the cell at each corner. Trevor ran under it and pushed upward from the middle. The cell was lifted, and after solving some logistical issues, they pushed it out of the big hole. As soon as they did, they almost collapsed in exhaustion. They were all peak newbies by now, but that fucking thing was still so heavy. Even Jenny and Trevor were initial Johns already, and it was still so heavy. Both were assigned to the Dreamer, which had turned into an adolescent about 3 months ago, so their advancement had sped up too. Nick was still working with the Bleeding Lady, but he wasn't producing as much Zephyx as Jenny or Trevor, which was why it took him longer to advance. Yet despite 2 Johns helping, it was still not easy to move the repelling cell. "Come on, boss is still in there," Trevor said through heavy breathing. "Let's get this thing back to Dark Dream." The other extractors nodded and lifted the cell again. Some minutes later, the extractors moved through the outer city carrying the repelling cell. Naturally, that created a lot of buzz, and people watched with interest. Almost all the other manufacturers noticed and sent their people to watch. They all knew what a repelling cell was, and what it meant when several extractors carried one through the streets, especially an active one. Most of the manufacturers were impressed. Some had heard of Cycle and Dark Dream but hadn't paid much attention. They barely had any Specters or Extractors. However, capturing a Force Specter was a kind of milestone. It was one of the most difficult things to do. It needed a ton of money, intense planning, and many powerful Extractors. That made Force Specters very valuable. While a Force Specter didn't produce more Zephyx than any other kind, just the investment needed to capture one made it worth a lot. Some manufacturers would probably even pay 10 million credits. Since Dark Dream had captured a Force Specter, it had become an actual manufacturer in the eyes of the others. The Spartans, the manufacturer just one place above Dark Dream, only had a single Force Specter. And the Spartans had 4 veterans, over 20 Johns, and over 40 newbies. They had over 10 Specters, one about to become an adult. Yet they only had a single Force Specter, which was also their main one. So even though the size and power difference between Dark Dream and the Spartans was massive, the other manufacturers now often mentioned them together. A manufacturer that could capture a Force Specter was a good one. Naturally, the other manufacturers now paid more attention to Dark Dream. It was becoming interesting to them. Before the cell reached Dark Dream's building, the other manufacturers had already figured out what kind of Specter was inside. Everyone knew about the fog, and everyone had seen where the Extractors had come from. It was pretty obvious the fog was in there. The manufacturers didn't really care. No one wanted to invest the money to capture the fog anyway. They didn't mind that dark dream caught it. Chapter 188, Captured. Nick felt the floor moving below him and knew his people were carrying the cell to the building. He just wanted to sleep, but he kept himself awake. About an hour later, Nick felt himself being pulled upward, which told him the repelling cell was being hoisted. He knew the whole plan, a pulley on the roof. The bad part was that this meant all the onlookers knew on which floor the fog would be contained, but there was nothing to do about it. The repelling cell was too big to fit through the doors, and carrying it up the staircase would take hours. Every hour the cell was active used up a kilo of Zephyx. It wasn't worth the millions just to keep the floor a secret, so they pulled it up the side of the building. When the cage reached the 6th floor, the extractors removed the walls, pulled it inside, and put the walls back. The onlookers talked among themselves for a while before leaving, since there was nothing left to see. On the 6th floor, the extractors carried the cell to the expensive containment unit for the fog. Since all the containment units were surrounded by the building's inner walls, it didn't look any different from the others. But strip off the walls, and it looked very different. There were many small windows with sensors and cameras. There were so many expensive wires and tubes running around it. And the console was almost 5 times as big as the others. This thing had so many functions, couldn't be compared to the other containment units. This thing was a beast. Jenny and Nick had undergone a 5-day training course on how to operate it, taught by its designers. They were the only two who could. The main door opened, sounding a loud, scary alarm. Then everyone waited. To ensure no Specter was accidentally released, the unit sounded the alarm for a full 5 minutes before opening, to make absolutely sure no one was trying to secretly open it. 5 minutes later, a big part of the wall opened, the walls shifting into a form that mirrored the repelling cell's shape perfectly. The cell and the containment unit were made by the same company and were obviously compatible. The extractors moved the repelling cell to the hole and heard several clicks. After making sure all 8 clicks sounded, they stepped away. Jenny went to the containment unit's console and pressed several buttons. Then she nodded to Trevor. Trevor nodded back and pressed a button on the side of the repelling cell. The cell shone even brighter, and half a cylinder of Zephyx emptied immediately. The humming turned even louder. Bang! The wall of the cell facing the containment unit shot open with incredible force. Boom! Then the cell exploded in bright white light, and all the extractors had to shield their eyes. Inside the repelling cell, Nick's eyes went wide as the fog instantly vanished from around him. The next moment, he saw it hit the distant wall of the containment unit. Bang! The wall of the containment unit slammed shut with insane power, and the wires turned white and purple. Nick heard a low humming from the unit, but nothing like the ear-shattering noise of the repelling cell. Outside, Jenny pressed several buttons on the console and checked all the metrics. Everyone waited with bated breath. About a minute later, Jenny sighed. "Everything looks good," she said with a smile. Immediately, some extractors sat on the floor in relief while others cheered. They had done it. "We can celebrate later," Jenny said. "Get boss out of there first." The extractors walked up to the repelling cell, and Trevor pressed several buttons. After 8 clinks, he gestured for them to move the cage back, and they did. Inside, Nick saw the cell getting moved away from the wall, and sighed in relief. The next second, Trevor looked in and smiled. "We got it." Nick smiled back and walked out. As soon as he did, all the extractors cheered. Their chief Zephyx Extractor had done it. Without him, they couldn't have captured the fog. He'd been the one who located it, kept it busy, and moved it into the cage. He'd also been the only one in true danger. Not a single extractor wasn't proud of Nick, and they were happy to have a competent boss. Nick smiled with embarrassment, rubbing the back of his head. "Well done, everyone," Winter said, clapping for his employees. "You all did amazing work today." The extractors smiled respectfully. Then Winter walked over to Nick and put a hand on his shoulder. "Good job, Nick," he said. "I knew it wasn't a mistake to invest so much in you." Naturally, he spoke the latter part quietly. "Thanks, Winter," Nick answered with a sigh. "I'm beat. I just want to eat something and sleep." Winter nodded with a laugh. "I can imagine. Then I won't keep you any longer. Have a fun night, and we'll see each other the day after tomorrow." Nick and Winter had already agreed Nick would get the day off after capturing the fog. "Thanks, I really need that now," Nick said. Winter just laughed. Chapter 189, New Ability. Nick left Dark Dream, got something to eat, and went asleep. The next day, Nick went to the arena he and Reynold had created over a year ago. By now, Reynold and Mainla had stopped training him, but he still used their grounds for his own training. Blitz had its own training rooms, much better than these, so the two of them didn't need to use these places anymore. After finishing his regular workout, Nick decided to test his new ability. He still wasn't sure what it actually did. He quickly found an abandoned house and entered, since he didn't want anyone learning what kind of ability he had. While his first ability was literally impossible to see, his new one could be seen. Wintour had said Nick turned blurry. Nick's ability was active, so nobody could see him. That was the best opportunity to test the new one. Nick lifted his right arm, looked at it, and activated his ability. His arm turned cloudy and almost transparent. His eyes widened, and he looked at the rest of his body. Everything had turned cloudy and blurry, like he was looking at himself through an extremely dirty, grimy window. The next moment, he touched his left arm with his right hand, and his eyes widened in shock. His right arm passed through his left. Next, Nick moved his arm rapidly through his body, and that was when he noticed what was going on. Part of his blurry body was leaving him and being pushed away like smoke. "I'm fog," Nick thought. Sure enough, he looked like some kind of colorful fog. The part of his body that had been pushed away slowly flew back and reattached itself. Next, Nick moved around. He could keep his form while moving, but the faster he moved, the blurrier and less distinct his shape became. It was like his body was trying to keep its shape but was too sluggish to do it rapidly and consistently. Even more, he started to feel weak and his head began to ache. So he deactivated his ability. In an instant, the fog turned solid and his body reappeared. That's how the fog couldn't notice me, Nick thought. It didn't have eyes and it probably couldn't hear either. It could only perceive me by touch. So when I turned into fog, it lost its perception of me. It's probably the same with humans. When I turn into fog, they can't feel me since I won't feel any different from air. But in that state, I also can't interact with anything. I can't use my weapons or damage anything. Speaking of, Nick activated his ability again and looked at his clothing and weapons. Surprisingly, they turned into fog too. Even his barrier turned into fog. Very strange. Next, Nick pulled out one of his spears while in his fog state, and materialized again with the spear in his hand. This means I can manipulate and change my body shape while I'm fog, Nick thought. Nick experimented with his fog state for over an hour, and finally created a full profile of it. Sure enough, there has to be a weakness. It can't all be this perfect all the time, he thought with furrowed brows. When he'd been inside the fog, Nick had transformed his body many times but never ran out of Zephyx, so deactivating and activating his ability didn't cost any Zephyx. Yet there had to be a cost, and he'd found it. Keeping his body in one piece cost Zephyx. If Nick just stood in the same position, he could permanently keep his fog state active since he wasn't using any Zephyx. But when he moved, his body used Zephyx to keep the fog clumped together. The more his fog moved, the more Zephyx it used to pull itself back. It was a bit like a man attached to two heavy weights on the ground. Standing still, he didn't need to carry them, but moving in any direction meant using power to drag them. While kicking inside the fog, Nick had been using a bit of Zephyx, which was why he'd become so hungry and exhausted, but not a lot, since the movement was controlled. Things would be very different if the movement became involuntary, like getting punched, kicked, or shot. Then his body would disperse in many directions, requiring a ton of Zephyx to fix. And if he didn't have enough Zephyx, Nick wasn't sure, but the most logical explanation was that he'd automatically return to his normal form, at whatever location his body was. Nick tested this by punching a wall in his fog state. As soon as his foggy hand hit the wall, it exploded and scattered across it. When his hand returned to his body, he felt quite exhausted. He assumed he'd used nearly 30% of his Zephyx storage to pull his hand back into place, and that was just punching a stationary wall. If someone kicked through his body. Zephyx Extractors were extraordinarily powerful. A proper kick from a John would create a huge gust of wind. That would disperse Nick's entire body. He was almost certain he'd die in that situation. Using the fog state in direct combat was extremely risky. It was more useful for running away, repositioning, or general movement. Luckily, there weren't only bad things about this ability. Nick had also found quite a few useful things. Chapter 190, Strengths and Weaknesses. For example, Nick noticed that moving was very different from normal. While he was many times slower in his fog state, there were a couple of interesting things. He could cling to any surface and move along it quietly, slithering up a huge building like a spider without any issues. Then he could simply materialize on top with all his equipment. Sadly, Nick couldn't just fly. His fog needed to be attached to something, and it couldn't move too fast or he'd lose a lot of Zephyx. He tried to throw a spear and attach himself to it while it flew, but immediately stopped when he felt his Zephyx vanish at insane speeds, mostly due to the strong wind. After that, Nick took a while to come to terms with the fact that a strong gust of wind could kill him if he wasn't careful. But there was one other interesting thing. Nick could fit through tiny openings as long as he moved through them very slowly. Moving slowly through a small hole meant he didn't need as much Zephyx to recover his shape. He'd moved through one of the grates on the ground and entered the sewers. That move cost him 20% of his Zephyx and took almost half a minute. But that was still impressive. Nick could now easily enter the sewers and even travel through them by clinging to the ceiling. The sewers had essentially transformed into pathways he could use. Well, as long as there was light, traveling through the darkness was still dangerous. Nick had a lot more experience with the nightmare, but traveling through its world was still extremely dangerous. If he accidentally commanded his body to move away from the ceiling, he'd drop into the sewers. He might land above the liquid since he wasn't very dense, but he might also fall into it and disperse. Nick didn't want to find out. But this wasn't the only use of the ability. For once, the nightmare's existence actually helped Nick. Nearly every single building in Crimson Fungus City had holes in its walls and ceilings so sunlight could enter, and Nick could fit through them. Sure, it cost some Zephyx and took a while, but it was possible. In summary, the ability was extraordinarily useful in non-combat scenarios, but almost useless during combat, unless his opponent was blind and deaf. I'd say it's pretty useful, Nick thought. My battle style already relies mostly on finding ways to escape my opponent's perception and attacking from there, and this ability achieves just that. But now, I wonder what kind of ability the normal one from the fog is. This was a mutation of Nick's ability granted by the null. It was not the ability the fog would give someone without one. Clearly, the ability Nick received worked to make it harder for people to perceive him, which was exactly what his main ability was about. Almost every ability Nick received from any Specter would somehow try to reduce the ways he could be perceived. Some were simply more fitting than others. The fog's ability was obviously very fitting to Nick's main ability, which was to be expected. A less fitting one would have been the lover. Maybe the lover would have made Nick invisible to people who wanted to have sex with him. Not very useful. Someone would actually need to see him to even think about it. Maybe the dreamer would have made him very quiet for sleeping people. Also not very useful. Eventually, Nick finished his research and trained a bit more. Even though he had a free day, he still hated doing nothing. Over a year had passed since the incident, but Nick was still a bit scared of quiet, isolated moments. Whenever he was alone with nothing to do, he felt nervous. This made sleeping difficult, but he circumvented the problem by training so much that he was always completely exhausted before bed. Maybe once he achieved his goal, these problems would vanish. Nick could only hope. So after a lot of training and planning, Nick went to sleep. The next day, Nick entered Dark Dream again and did his daily duties. Get the Zephyx canisters, measure the Zephyx, put the canisters and measurements in Wintour's office. Check if the screaming coffin needed a new corpse and give it one if so. Get the fresh garbage from the delivery man and dump it onto the dung heap. Work with the bleeding lady. Ask Jenny if anything of note happened. Those were the regular duties Nick did every morning. When they were done, he either planned something for the Extractors, talked with Wintour, searched for Specters, or coordinated with Dark Dream's investigator department. But today, Nick would do something different. Someone had to find out the best way to work with the fog, and that was his job. How long could someone survive in the fog? Was it possible to sleep in it? Could more than one person enter? Would that produce more or less Zephyx? What was the easiest way to break out? How much Zephyx did it produce? There were many things Nick had to check. Any inaccuracies on his part, and Dark Dream might lose tens of thousands of credits in potential profits per day. When Nick was finally done with his daily duties, he told Jenny and Wintour he'd be experimenting with the fog. And then he went to the 6th floor. Chapter 191, Nothingness. Nick looked at the entrance to the locker room leading to the fog's containment unit and sighed. He always felt a bit nervous before working with a Specter for the first time. He knew he'd manage just fine, but the unknown still made him apprehensive. Next, Nick walked over to the huge console beside the entrance and inspected it. He knew how it worked thanks to the training course, but he still wasn't comfortable with it. He spent several minutes familiarizing himself and looked at all the statistics. The fog was contained without any issues, but its escape attempts had cost some Zephyx. Keeping a force Specter contained required Zephyx. After being locked in for over a full day, the fog had cost about 7 grams. A necessary cost, but not super high. The fog was at least a mid-adolescent, making it at least equal to the dung heap. The The dung heap had been here much longer, but the literal food it required to grow was ridiculous, so it wasn't growing at maximum capacity. Because of that, it had only recently become a mid-adolescent. And the fog was most likely a mid or late adolescent, and compared to the dung heap, it was actually dangerous. The most the dung heap did was try to consume a Zephyx Extractor, and it wasn't very agile. If someone didn't jump away immediately, they'd get consumed, but any extractor would obviously jump away as soon as it showed aggression. This made the dung heap as dangerous as a mid-hatchling or so. Containing it wasn't an issue. As long as it had food, it didn't even attempt to escape. It was just happy where it was. Meanwhile, the fog would kill any Zephyx Extractor in Dark Dream except Nick, since none of them had the power to escape its domain. Luckily, it killed extremely slowly, which meant Nick could still use others to work with it. Well, no need to delay the inevitable, Nick thought, walking into the locker room. Nick left his spears at the side and walked in with only his fist weapons. As soon as he opened the door, the force field inside the containment unit intensified, pushing the fog away from the entrance. Nick entered, and the door closed behind him. The force field retreated, and the fog enveloped him. He immediately felt his ability deactivating, but that didn't matter for now. Nick walked forward about 50 meters, making sure he was well and truly inside the fog's domain. The fact that he could walk 50 meters inside a 5x5 meter room was proof enough. After that, he stopped. Well, now we wait, Nick thought. Then he scratched the back of his neck. Minutes passed. It's a bit boring. There wasn't much to do in an endless void of nothingness. I could train, but that would create gaps in the fog, reducing the Zephyx produced, since it would need to repair them. In the end, Nick just lay down and looked upward. There was nothing to do. Nick's mind drifted through his memories. Whenever he thought of Horua, he felt his insides cramping up. I just have to redeem myself, Nick thought. I just have to help all the people of the Dregs and this guilt will vanish. But then Julian's words echoed through his mind. Would Horua really wish for something like that? How would helping others make Horua forgive him? Horua had been a child, and he probably wouldn't sacrifice himself for a bunch of people who shunned and exploited him. Julian had said Nick needed to accept he'd committed a mistake and live with it. Trying to redeem himself by helping others wouldn't lessen the guilt. He'd just keep feeling guilty because he'd never feel he'd done enough. And that feeling would remain because he wasn't dealing with the root cause, Horua. Do I really need to repay the people of the Dregs? So many of them stole my food when I was a child, and they even stole the little bit of credits I managed to collect. Do they deserve a better life? Nick wasn't sure. He just kept looking into the nothingness. But if I don't help the people, what's the purpose of my life? Why am I alive then? To become rich? What's the point of being rich when I can't even feel happy? To get a girlfriend? My guilt would still eat me up inside. To become powerful? And then what? Great, I'm powerful, I can do whatever I want. But what's the point when I still feel guilty? What's the point of anything if this darkness in my chest won't vanish? Nick felt his chest shaking with nervousness, stress, and anxiety. As long as this darkness persists, all my achievements are meaningless. But how can I deal with it? Julian said helping the people of the Dregs won't help with my guilt. However, does it need to? All my achievements won't mean anything with this darkness. But that's only if my goal is to be happy. What if my goal is just to improve the lives of others? A selfless goal, you know. Couldn't I have then said that living my life wasn't a waste? After all, who else can claim to have helped so many people? Nick took a deep breath. But I want to be happy. No matter how grand my goal is, in the end I still want happiness. I don't know. Chapter 192, A Lot of Zephyx. After an unknown period of time, Nick started to feel tired. Night hadn't arrived yet, but the total lack of stimulus had tired him. Nick kept thinking about his life, but no matter how much he thought, he couldn't find a real solution. His mind kept trying to make peace with everything, but it just went in circles like it was caught in an inescapable maze. The more he thought, the more hopeless his situation seemed. After a while, his mind started to drift and think about things he couldn't discern. He felt like his mind was working, but he had no idea on what. For a long time, he just looked into the nothingness beside him. He started to get hungry, but it seemed so unimportant. It was like all of Nick's power and care had left him. None of this mattered. Sleeping in here might be dangerous, Nick thought as his eyes closed. However, I don't think the fog kills people in their sleep. At least the chances are extremely small. When we caught it, I attacked it for hours with my ability, and it still didn't let me go, which means it was producing a ton of Zephyx, which in turn means it produces Zephyx by isolating living beings. Killing me would stop its production, and that's not what it wants. Under normal circumstances, Nick still wouldn't risk sleeping inside the fog, but with his current mindset, he just didn't care enough to spend more time awake in its domain. So he decided to sleep. Surprisingly, the fog felt so comfortable. Its temperature was just perfect, and Nick felt nice and warm. He didn't even feel thirsty. Sure, he was getting hungry, but as someone who'd grown up in the dregs, Nick was used to sleeping while hungry. And finally, Nick fell asleep, a dreamless sleep. It was almost like no time had passed. When Nick opened his eyes, he wasn't even sure if he'd actually slept. He had no idea how late it was or how long he'd been in here. Had he actually slept? I must have, Nick thought. I feel quite a bit hungrier. Nick slowly sat up and took a deep breath. Well, I don't know how long I've been in here, but I already learned one important thing. People can sleep inside the fog. That means the shifts can be extended. Maybe one person going in for 24 hours, then getting 2 days of rest. I bet several of the extractors would love that timetable. The puppy and the dreamer are both worked with 24 hours a day in 3 8-hour shifts. The lover is worked with by Kiara. That means 7 extractors are constantly busy, and I only have 7. As far as I can see, the fog needs another 3. Seems like I have to get at least 3 new people. I might as well use the opportunity to find out what abilities the puppy, the lover, and the fog give to new extractors. But first, I need to check a couple of things. After that, Nick stood up and readied himself. Bang, bang, bang. Nick unleashed many punches and kicks while turning into fog and back. Huge gaps appeared, and he rapidly moved forward while attacking. Boom! Nick hit a wall and his entire body vibrated. After that, he attacked the wall while traveling along it. Eventually, he found the employee exit and the button for opening it. After a punch, he quickly pressed the button. Whoom! The fog around him was pushed back as the containment unit strengthened its force field. The door shot open, and Nick quickly walked through, the door closing behind him. Then Nick stretched in relaxation. He was glad to be done working with the fog. Nick grabbed his things and walked to the lobby. After asking the receptionist the time, he knew how long he'd been in there. About 12 hours, Nick thought. I guess that's a good metric. Nick walked back to the 6th floor and checked the Zephyx container. 67 grams in 12 hours, he thought with raised eyebrows. That's good. That's like 130 grams per day. If we deduct the 5 grams or so needed to contain it, that's still around 125. The dreamer is barely producing 70. But then Nick furrowed his brows. I need to test if the fog always produces this much, or if it depends on the power of the person inside. Nick replaced the container and walked to the 3rd floor. After 2 doors, he was greeted by a blonde lady playing with a cute puppy. This was Marvilla, one of the Zephyx Extractors they'd gotten from Ghosty's lab. When Marvilla saw the door open, she furrowed her brows. She had to stop already, but when she saw Nick, her eyes shot open. I didn't refuse to leave, she immediately shouted defensively. I know, Nick said. I'm here for something else. Am I in trouble? No, Nick answered. I need you to test something for our new Specter. Are you fine staying a couple hours longer today? You don't have to if you don't want to. Oh, what for? I want to see if the fog produces less Zephyx with weaker extractors. I want you to stay inside it just as long as I did, 12 hours. Naturally, if there are any issues, I'll get you out. Marvilla furrowed her brows. Am I getting paid for that? Same as always, Nick said. You get 10% of what you produce. Marvilla uttered, falling into thought. Sure, but I need someone to tell my family I won't be coming home on time. Of course, Nick said. Chapter 193, New Timetable. A couple minutes later, Marvilla entered the containment unit. Nick told her everything he knew about the fog and how to behave. As soon as she stepped through the employee entrance, she stopped moving. The fog was being pushed away by the force field, and as soon as it deactivated, she'd be enveloped. When it was time to leave, as long as she didn't move from her spot, the force field should be able to pull her out again. Then Nick wouldn't even need to get involved. A moment later, the door closed, and Marvilla was enveloped. Outside, Nick grabbed one of the clerks and told them to stay in the locker room. If they heard any screams or commotion from the console, they had to send someone to get Nick. After that, Nick left Dark Dream, grabbed something to eat, trained, and slept. Early the next morning, Nick entered Dark Dream again. In 1 hour, he had to get Marvilla. For the next hour, he dealt with his daily chores. Finally, it was time. Nick walked to the locker room and opened the employee door. The fog was pushed away and Marvilla was gone. Nick furrowed his brows. Did she move? Nick cracked his neck and readied himself. Bang, 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 bang. Nick kept attacking his front and moving forward, making sure he wasn't hitting Marvilla by accident. For over a minute, he punched through the fog but couldn't find her. By now, he was worried. Thud. Suddenly, Nick nearly tripped over something. The thing on the ground quickly retreated in fright, and he realized it was Marvilla. She'd probably been sleeping and he'd woken her. "Marvilla, are you there?" Nick shouted. No reaction. Is she not hearing me? Nick thought. Or is she hearing me but the fog keeps isolating her? Nevertheless, Nick continued punching and kicking, and a couple of minutes later he felt her again. This time she didn't retreat. Nick grabbed her and asked if everything was okay. No answer. She probably can't hear me. Even our voices are isolated. Nick moved Marvilla's hands to his belt, and she grabbed it. Then he turned around and moved forward while unleashing kicks and punches. Her hands lost their grip whenever he turned to fog, making them desperately move forward in a panic. But after a while, they seemed to get used to Nick appearing and disappearing from their grasp. Several minutes later, Nick hit one of the walls and did the same thing as when he'd first exited the containment unit. Eventually, the force field activated, and Nick pulled Marvilla out. When he saw her, he could tell she was quite spooked, but that was the only concern. She didn't seem unhealthy or injured otherwise. "Everything all right?" Nick asked. Marvilla breathed heavily but nodded. "Yeah, that was terrifying. I thought you were a second Specter or something earlier." "Sorry," Nick said. "Anyway, what did you experience in there?" "Well, nothing really," Marvilla said. "As soon as the fog surrounded me, I sat on the ground and leaned against the wall behind me. I was thinking about random things and getting tired. At some point I fell asleep, and I woke up when you touched me. I got startled and moved away, but I quickly realized it was probably you and, well, you know the rest." Nick furrowed his brows. "So you didn't move?" "No," Marvilla said, shaking her head. "I didn't move a single step until you touched me." Nick scratched his chin. "Strange, because I didn't find you near the entrance. I had to look for you for several minutes." Marvilla's eyes widened in shock and horror. "What?" Nick just nodded. "It seems the fog can move people without them noticing. And I don't move slowly through the fog at all. I can get from one end of the containment unit to the other in barely 10 seconds. Yet it took me minutes to find you." Marvilla didn't seem happy at all now. Eventually, the two of them left the locker room, and Nick checked the Zephyx. 48 grams of Zephyx, Nick said. Marvilla's eyes widened in shock. 48 grams. When she worked with the puppy, she barely produced 7 grams after 8 hours. This was like an entire week of her salary in one day of work. "That means the power of the extractor is relevant to how much Zephyx the fog produces," Nick muttered. "Thanks, you can go home now," Nick told Marvilla. "Oh, okay," she said. "Do I get to work with the fog again?" "Not sure," Nick said. "I have to talk with Wintour and Jenny about this." The two said goodbye, and Nick went to Wintour's office after calling Jenny over. Then the three of them talked about everything Nick knew about the fog. In the end, they created a new timetable for the employees. Since the fog produced the most Zephyx, the Johns were assigned to it, meaning Jenny and Trevor would stay inside for 24 hours each, followed by 2 rest days. Of course, Jenny wouldn't get 2 full days off. She wouldn't need to work with the Dreamer, but she still needed to be available in case one of her extractors needed her. After some talking, they also decided something else. They scrapped the plan of making Trevor a spy. They needed a second team leader, and Trevor was the best candidate by far. So Trevor was promoted to team leader. When Jenny was with the fog, Trevor would be team leader, and vice versa. Of course, they also needed a third employee for the fog, and in the end they decided on Jonathan, who was closest to becoming the next John. Naturally, the duty of getting employees out of the fog was added to Nick's daily list. So Jenny, Trevor, and Jonathan worked with the fog. The Dreamer would be worked with by Marvilla, Larry, and Constance, the 3 from Ghosty's lab. The Lover would be worked with by Kiara. The Screaming Coffin, the Dung Heap, and the Bleeding Lady were for Nick. And the Puppy. That one would be left for the 3 new people Nick would be hiring very soon. The Puppy was by far the least dangerous and easiest to work with among the relatively normal Specters, which made it perfect for new Extractors. Chapter 194, Promotion. Good news, Boss said he needs 3 more Extractors, and he's planning to get them from our team. A middle-aged man with black hair said to a team of 10 people in front of him. The others looked at each other in surprise and excitement. Finally, they had a chance to become Extractors. This opportunity was one of the biggest reasons they'd accepted this job. This was the investigator team of Dark Dream. As people who'd already worked for Dark Dream and come into contact with Specters, the investigators were very often the favorite candidates for new Zephyx Extractor positions. Becoming a Zephyx Extractor was a big promotion. The investigators already earned around 5,000 credits a month, which was quite a lot for the outer city, but becoming an extractor often meant a tenfold increase in pay at minimum. And the increase in power and status was even more valuable. As the investigators looked around, they grew more excited. Only 10 of their people had been called into the meeting. In total, there were around 30 investigators. So did this mean boss would only look through these 10? If so, that would be amazing. Will he choose one of us? One of the men asked. Yes, one of you, the leader said with a laugh. I already sent him all the files, and he said everyone present is considered for the position. The 10 grew more excited. All of them wanted to become extractors, and 3 of them would achieve their dream today. Sadly or luckily, depending on the viewpoint, the team leader and his 2 substitutes were not considered, but that had been clear from the beginning. To stop team leaders from abusing their power to make themselves seem better for promotion, Wintour and Nick had only hired rejected Zephyx Extractors for the team leader position. This meant the team leaders had already gained an ability from a Specter, but the ability wasn't good enough to become a Zephyx Extractor. On the other hand, they were paid 9,000 credits instead of 5,000. Such a large sum made them part of the richest 5% of the outer city. When will we know who's chosen? One of them asked. By the end of today, the leader said with a smile. This made the investigators even more excited, and they started talking animatedly. How will he choose them? Another asked. Well, at that moment the door opened, and a tall, extremely muscular person walked in. The investigators quieted down. Boss was here. Nick looked at all the gathered people with furrowed brows. Silence. Ammon, come to meeting room 2, Nick said before leaving again. Everyone looked at one of the investigators. Ammon, who had just been called, took a deep breath and left. Everyone else started talking. They were all discussing what questions boss would ask and how to best answer to be chosen. Should they say they were brave and strong to show confidence, or would that make them seem arrogant and hard to manage? Should they lie about which Specters they'd met to seem more experienced? Should they praise boss to get in his good graces, or would that disgust him? Should they say they were outgoing and liked talking to fit into a team, or would that make them seem lazy and easily distracted? The investigators had worked with Nick several times but didn't really talk much. Nick mostly talked to the team leaders who relayed his orders. At most, they'd made a bit of small talk. Nick always seemed friendly and genuine, but was he really like that with his team? What if he was a tyrant who wanted total discipline? After about 10 minutes, the person Nick had called came back. He seemed neutral, and no one could tell if he'd done well or badly. Cryon, you're next, he said. He's waiting in meeting room 2. Cryon took a deep breath, nodded, and left. By now, the people could tell Nick was calling them in alphabetical order. Cryon walked across the corridor and entered meeting room 2. His heart beat loudly, and he'd already started to sweat from anxiety. Good morning, Cryon, the muscular, intimidating man said with a friendly tone and smile. Please, take a seat. Good morning, boss, Cryon said, sitting down. Silence. Now how are you with Specters? Boss asked in his deep voice. Cryon became even more nervous. This was such an open question. How was he supposed to answer that? Cryon started. The intimidating man said nothing and just waited. Cryon almost felt like he was sitting in front of a Specter. This was the chief Zephyx Extractor of Dark Dream. All in all, Dark Dream had over 50 employees, and the chief Zephyx Extractor basically decided who got hired and fired among the investigators and extractors. And they were talking about Cryon's future. If he messed up, he wouldn't only miss his promotion but might even get fired. Cryon felt his heart beating in his head with untold intensity. There was silence for 20 full seconds. I don't know, Cryon eventually said with a nervous, awkward smile. Except for the puppy, I never met one. Nick wrote something down. And what about the puppy? How did you handle it? Cryon's mind froze again. He had no idea how to answer that. Chapter 195, Crushing the Puppy. You already met the puppy, right? Trevor asked. Cryon nodded. Yes, I had it in my arms for a couple of hours across a couple of days. Right now, Cryon and Trevor stood in front of the locker room, leading to the puppy's containment unit. Surprisingly, Cryon got the promotion. He thought he'd done horribly since he froze several times during the interview. He never expected to be chosen. Yet, funnily enough, everyone else had felt the same way. All of them had frozen solid during their talk with Nick, and some had even needed Nick to prod them to continue. In the end, Nick told the three lucky ones he'd used a bit of Zephyx during their talks, which made them all nervous and scared. After thousands of years, humans had evolved to become scared when Zephyx was around them. Zephyx meant a Specter, and humans who didn't immediately flee from a Specter had a higher likelihood of dying. Together with the power imbalance between Nick and the investigators, this achieved a result similar to sitting in front of a Specter. So the fact that Cryon managed to answer after 20 seconds of silence was definitely not bad. Good, so you know what to expect, Trevor said. However, things will be a bit different this time. How so? Cryon asked. Because we want to see the ability the puppy can give new extractors, Trevor explained. As you know, humans gain abilities by being in contact with Specters. Cryon nodded. Yet, even though all of you held the puppy for multiple hours, none of you gained its ability. Cryon blinked a couple of times. Right, that was strange. Why hadn't he thought of that? This means the normal way of working with it most likely won't cut it, Trevor said. We haven't tested it yet, but we presume you need to get it to cry out and injure you if you want its ability. At least, that's what Boss believes. Cryon took a deep breath. When he'd signed his new contract, he'd read he would gain the puppy's ability, but he hadn't thought much about it. What happens when it cries? Cryon asked nervously. You saw Boss when we caught the puppy, Trevor said. You know what happens. Cryon gulped. He'd seen Nick in intense pain back then. If someone as strong and intimidating as Boss was in so much pain, how would he feel? Don't worry, Trevor said with a smile. I'll be right beside you. Yet Cryon was still scared, but for his future he wouldn't retreat now. I know it's a lot for your first day, Trevor said, but at least you don't have it as bad as Carrie. Why, what's with Carrie? Cryon asked. Trevor sighed. She's going to get the lover's ability. Is that bad? The ability? I don't know the process of getting it. Yes, very much so, Trevor explained. Cryon gulped again. Let's get right in, shall we? Trevor said with a smile. Then the two walked into the containment unit while Trevor explained how the units worked. Right now, nobody was working with the puppy, since all the more experienced extractors were busy with the fog and the dreamer. As soon as they entered, the puppy excitedly ran up to them. It seemed very happy. Trevor picked it up and held it for a bit. The puppy couldn't understand human speech, so Trevor didn't explain what was about to happen before handing it to Cryon. Cryon held it awkwardly and looked at it. It was so hard to associate this cute little doggy with a terrifying Specter. It was just so cute and helpless. Crush it. Huh? Cryon asked, looking at Trevor. Crush it, Trevor said. It's a Specter. If you want it to cry, you have to attack it. If you're worried about it, don't be. It's a peak hatchling. You couldn't crush it even if you stood on its head. Cryon still looked at Trevor in complete confusion. Then he looked at the puppy. Crush it. This little cute thing. A dark void appeared in Cryon's chest. He felt like he'd been asked to do something impossible and unforgivable. How? Cryon asked. Punch it, try to crush its head, tightly hug it, I don't know, Trevor said. Even though it's a Specter, it acts like a puppy. So even though you can't injure it, it'll still act like it's getting injured when you try. Cryon's heart rate increased as he looked at the cute puppy with fear. He didn't want to crush it. It was so cute. Crush it, Trevor shouted. Cryon looked around nervously. Do it. Cryon's hands shook. Crush it. Then Cryon tightly hugged the puppy, and it started to yelp in discomfort. At that point, Cryon noticed how resilient and tough its body actually was, and his emotions finally accepted this was a Specter, not an innocent puppy. So he used all his power to hug it tightly. The puppy started to whimper and screech in terror and pain. Cryon started to scream in pain too, as he felt his insides being torn apart. However, he didn't let go, and the two of them continued to scream. That's enough, Trevor shouted, yanking the puppy out of Cryon's arms. The puppy continued to cry, and Trevor just threw it to the side. Immediately, it retreated to a corner and looked at Trevor and Cryon with fear. It looked so scared and vulnerable. Cryon's entire body shook, and then he puked vomit mixed with blood. Trevor took out a small vial of green liquid and dropped one drop into Cryon's mouth. This will keep you alive, but it'll still take a while to recover. Boss said the injuries can't be healed by recovery liquid. You get the next 2 days off. Chapter 196, Abilities. Cryon left Dark Dream in shock, pain, and horror, and for the next 2 days he felt like he was going through hell. He was no longer bleeding, but he felt like all his organs were inflamed. Eating? Drinking, breathing, and sleeping were painful. He would have run to the hospital if Trevor hadn't said there was nothing they could do. Cryon just needed to hold out, and he'd recover with time. Over the next couple of days, his family took care of him. Luckily, their love made things easier. But on the second day, an incident occurred. Cryon was recovering in bed when his sister accidentally pressed too hard on his stomach, which made him cry out in pain. At the same time, his sister also cried out and retreated in panic, constantly looking at her hand in horror. After a quick argument, they realized what had happened. When his sister had touched him, she'd felt like her hand was submerged in acid. However, that was the only time it happened. All the other times, things were fine. The two experimented a bit and found out what was going on. When Cryon cried or screamed, his body became dangerous. Anyone who touched him while he was screaming would feel like they'd touched acid. When the 2 days of rest were over, Cryon told his team leader, Trevor, about his ability. A bit later, Nick arrived and asked Cryon to use his ability on him, which he did. Cryon felt quite embarrassed shouting so loudly in front of others, but he did it anyway. After a while, Nick confirmed it felt identical to the pain he'd been in when they captured the puppy. This meant that, most likely, Cryon was tearing Zephyx out of whoever touched him, which made it feel like his body was acid to others. They experimented more and found an additional aspect. The Zephyx torn out of the other person was absorbed by Cryon. He used Zephyx to use his ability, but he also recovered Zephyx by using it. This meant he could keep damaging his opponent as long as they touched, and his vocal cords didn't give out. The only bad part was that the damage accumulated very slowly. It would probably take almost 10 seconds of constant contact and screaming to severely injure someone at the same level. In the end, they noted the ability down and told Cryon to keep it secret, which Specter gave what ability was sensitive information. Eventually, Cryon was told his schedule and he sighed. He had to work with the puppy for 8 hours a day. He just hoped it wasn't too angry at him. Meanwhile, Nick finished the document he'd created about the Specters and their abilities. He now knew all the abilities his Specters gave to new Extractors. The Dreamer gave someone the ability to make others sleepy and read their dreams. The Bleeding Lady gave the ability to put an additional cutting effect on attacks and weapons. The Dung Heap gave the ability to release poisonous gas over a big area. The Screaming Coffin gave no abilities. The Puppy gave the ability to tear Zephyx out of anyone who touched them, but one had to scream to activate it. The Lover had an interesting but straightforward ability. It made others horny. That was it. There were a couple of uses. It could subtly make someone believe they were attracted to the person with the ability. If someone constantly got horny looking at the same person, they'd think they were attracted to them. This would be good for spying and gaining information, but it could also be used in a fight. When one was horny, one's blood gathered in one's nether regions, meaning less for the brain, and the enemy would be quite confused. In the case of men, it could even act as a small hindrance to movement, based on the size of their thing. It would also embarrass them, making them more likely to make mistakes born of emotion. However, if the one with the ability lost, their death might become quite a bit worse, since the enemy might be motivated to relieve their lust. Lastly, the Fog gave the ability to launch clouds of fog, which the user could see through. Only the person with the ability could see through it. Everyone else would be blinded. This had no direct offensive power, but it made it easier to escape and confuse the enemy. Nick was especially interested in it. If he had someone with him who could launch fog, he could fight with much more power since his ability would be active longer. Sadly, even though Nick's ability had been augmented by the fog, he still couldn't see through fog launched by someone with the ability. He'd have to see how things developed. There were quite a few ability combinations that seemed useful. During the next couple of days, the 3 new Extractors, Cryon, Carrie, and Taryn, got familiar with their new jobs and settled in. All 3 belonged to Trevor's team. Excluding Nick, Dark Dream had 10 Extractors. Jenny led the advanced team, consisting of Jonathan and the 3 from Ghosty's lab, Constance, Marvilla, and Larry. Trevor led the newbie team, consisting of Cryon, Carrie, and Taryn. Kiara was also part of Trevor's team, since she worked with the Lover and Carrie had the Lover's ability. And with that, Dark Dream could finally work with all of their Specters. Chapter 197, The Layers. "Hey, Wintour," Nick said as he entered Wintour's office for his daily meeting. Every day, Nick and Wintour had a quick afternoon meeting to talk things over. "Hey," Wintour answered as Nick sat down. "Got anything noteworthy?" "Not really," Nick said. "Just a bit of drama with the puppy." "Oh, what's it about?" "Carrie didn't want to leave when she was supposed to, and Trevor had to get involved," Nick answered. Wintour nodded. "Keep me posted on this. I don't want any extractors falling victim to the puppy. Of course, Nick answered. Is that it? Yep, that's everything. Wintour nodded. Then let me tell you about something interesting. Oh, Nick uttered. We got invited to the yearly meeting of manufacturers, Wintour said. Nick's eyes widened. There's a yearly meeting. I don't remember one happening last year. Because we didn't get invited, Wintour explained. We were just a bunch of newbies with some weak specters. Ever since we captured the fog, things changed. A manufacturer that can catch and contain a force specter is one that has proven itself. Because of that, the other manufacturers treat us as a new manufacturer, weak and inexperienced but real. Makes sense, Nick said. When's the meeting? Late morning in 3 days. It's on the middle layer of the inner city, Wintour said. Inner city, huh? Nick repeated. I've never been there. It's nothing too special, Wintour said. The lower layer is just like the outer city but cleaner, and the middle layer is hard to navigate, but that's the only special thing about it. What about the upper layer? Nick asked. Difficult to explain, Wintour said. Why don't you just see for yourself in the future? Nick scratched the back of his head. How do I get there? That's going to take a while, Wintour said with a chuckle. There are 2 ways to move up in the inner city, power and wealth. If you want to live on the lower layer, you need to either be a level 2 extractor or have a net worth of over 1 million credits. Nick's eyes widened in surprise. He knew he could live in the inner city as a John, but he hadn't heard about the wealth requirement. Of course, you only need one of the 2, Wintour said. By the way, if you live in the inner city, you're allowed to live there with your parents, your partner, and your children. You're not allowed to bring your siblings, uncles, and so on. At least, that's how it works for Zephyx Extractors. It's different for rich people, Nick asked. Wintour nodded. Every additional person who lives with you in the inner city, assuming you live there due to your net worth, requires another million of net worth. So if you want to live there with your wife and 2 children, you'd need a net worth of over 4 million credits. Nick took a deep breath. Why? Wintour chuckled. The people living in the inner city believe themselves vastly superior to everyone in the outer city, and they don't like upstarts from the filthy outer city joining their illustrious circles. His voice was quite sarcastic. If you get rich enough to join, they can tolerate you, but they don't want people who are worthless. Of course, most of the people thinking like that are living in the inner city only because someone else pays for them, he said with a chuckle. Nick didn't like what he was hearing. That sounded like a lot of hypocrisy. Why doesn't that apply to Zephyx Extractors? He asked. Can't you tell? Wintour asked. Nick just blinked a couple of times. Because Zephyx Extractors are scary and bring security. With their power, they can protect the people of the inner city from specters and threats, but they're also scary when you try to go against them. None of the normal but rich people want to antagonize someone who can tear them in 2 like a piece of paper. Nick furrowed his brows and nodded. That made sense. What about the middle layer? He asked. Level 3 extractor or 10 million credits, Wintour said. Nick took a deep breath. 10 million credits was insane. Naturally, the same policy applies here. If you want to live with your family on the middle layer, you'd better be even richer, Wintour said with a chuckle. Why is it so expensive? Nick asked. The amount of money required is ridiculous. Space, Wintour answered. Space, Nick repeated. Wintour nodded. Over 60% of the inner city is the lower layer, and only 30% is the middle layer. Additionally, the middle layer isn't on the ground and the residences are far bigger. At most, 1,000 people can fit on the middle layer. Nick's eyes widened in shock. Wait, only 1,000. Nick had seen the huge structure that was the inner city almost every day. It was around 5 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers tall. Tens of thousands of people should fit in there. Yet the middle layer could only hold about 1,000. And that was 30% of the city. Only 1,000, Wintour repeated. Due to the requirements, only about 800 spots are filled, and that's how they want it. Better to have more space than less. Then what about the upper layer? Nick asked. It has spots for about 300 people, Wintour said, and all of them are filled. If someone new joins, someone old has to descend to the middle layer. The poorest and weakest are not allowed to live there. Officially, you need to be a level 4 extractor or have a net worth of over 100 million credits, but practically, you need to belong to the stronger 20% of level 4 extractors or have over 500 million credits. Also, you don't get to take your entire family. You only get your significant other and up to 2 children. If you want more, you'd better be vastly more powerful than the average of the upper layer. Nick had difficulty accepting what he was hearing. "What about your family?" he asked. "We are 10 people. My mother and father, their mothers and fathers, and me and my 3 siblings. Oh, and our head butler and 2 head security guards. Everyone else has to travel to the upper layer for work." Chapter 198, Horrifying World. "So many people?" Nick asked. Wintour nodded. "We used to have our servants live in the upper layer too, but father decided to give up those 10 spaces after seeing how much trouble one of his Zephyx Extractors had finding a spot." Nick knew the Melfians were insanely influential, but once more, he was shocked by their power. Wintour's father was so rich and powerful that he dedicated over 1 billion credits just so his servants didn't have to travel so far to work. Such a mindset was unimaginable for Nick, who still felt nervous whenever he spent over 1,000 credits on anything. Wintour and Nick talked a while longer and planned everything for the meeting in 3 days. The next 2 days, Nick prepared for his trip, and then it was time to go. At about 8 a.m., Nick and Wintour walked out of Dark Dream and traveled toward the huge structure in the middle of the city. The gigantic pyramid-like structure had become so normal for Nick, but today it seemed more imposing than usual. Nick had never been inside. Today would be his first time going into the inner city. As they approached, Nick saw several guards. 4 stood by the entrance, and over 10 more were stationed on buildings around it. These were the force of the city, the extractors the manufacturers had to dedicate to it. None of them reacted as the 2 approached. A moment later, Wintour took out an emblem and held it up. Nick became nervous but kept walking. And then nothing. Nobody stopped them. The doors opened and the 2 walked in. "There's a scanner," Wintour said. "A scanner?" Nick asked. "There are scanners in the entrance that scan us. They saw my emblem and your uniform and let us through. The guards only react when the scanners tell them something's wrong." "Oh," Nick uttered, looking forward. The doors had already opened, and Nick saw another door. The next moment the door behind them closed and Wintour stopped walking. "Whir!" A loud sound came out of the walls, and blue liquid started to rain on them. "Cleansing liquid?" Nick asked in shock. Wintour nodded. The hall was around 10 meters long and 4 meters wide, and all of it was being doused in cleansing liquid. That was insane. Some seconds later, the cleansing liquid stopped and was siphoned into the ground. Then Nick felt several strong gusts of wind. A minute later, the wind stopped, and the sound from the walls quieted. Nick's nose twitched as he smelled something he'd never smelled before. What was this smell? It was so strange, but also comforting. Wintour noticed Nick's reaction. "It's plants and trees," he said. Nick's eyes widened. "That's how trees smell." Wintour nodded. Nick had heard of trees but had never seen one. The image of trees in his mind was unpleasant and terrifying. Huge, hard, brown pillars that rose from the ground and were also alive. That sounded like some specter or a monster from a horror story. And outside the city they were apparently everywhere. Wasn't that like some army of huge teeth from some huge monster? And since they were alive, they might even move. Nick imagined a huge pillar of metal bending to look closer at him. Also, since when did plants smell so nice? The plants that grew on the metallic walls of buildings didn't smell nice at all. The next moment, the big door in front of them opened, and Nick could finally see the inner city. Green, there was so much green. It was like everything was covered with veggie cubes. The streets were made of stone, formed into many identical shapes instead of metal. It looked so fancy and beautiful, but also unsafe. Nick craved the strength and certainty of steel. Stones didn't seem safe. However, only parts of the street were covered in stone. The others were made of ground. A couple of parts in the Dregs in the outer city were made of actual ground, but that ground was hard and resistant, while this looked green. Then Nick noticed the ground wasn't actually green. It was covered in many little green hairs that swayed gently in an artificial breeze. Nick was immediately reminded of the hairy mold he once ate off a wall when he was younger. Was this mold? Why would anyone cover the ground in mold? That's disgusting. A moment later, Nick saw something even stranger. A big brown pillar with a big umbrella of green growths. The growths moved in the wind and Nick started to feel nervous. Was that a tree? And were these weird green things the leaves he'd heard about? Yet before Nick could say anything, he noticed something else. Water. So much water. There was some kind of long, wide stream, over 5 meters wide and very deep, the water constantly moving in one direction. That was when Nick realized how rich everyone in here was. So much clean water just being here, without being used. This was insane. Wintour looked at Nick with an amused expression as Nick kept looking around in horror. It was like Nick had entered some kind of horrifying, alien world. "You'll get used to it," Wintour said. What? Nick asked, looking at him. Come, Winter said, gesturing with his head toward one of the grassy fields. Nick awkwardly followed. Winter stepped onto the grass and sat down with a smile. Then he gestured to the grass beside him. Come touch it,